Okay, we
We're
are
live.
live. So
Yeah.
here, let's,
One moment.
oh, thank you.
Yeah. And wait till I start here. Okay.
Now we got it. Great. So tonight is May 17th. It is 7:04 p.m. I'm calling to order the Common Council Ordinance Committee regular meeting. My roll call, I will just acknowledge everybody who's here. Tom Livingston, Tom Keegan, Dominique Johnson, Josh Goldstein, David Hugelman are all here who are on our committee. Also joining us this evening is Nicole Ayers and also Diane Revolus. We're expecting other council people, and there she is, the person we're expecting. Nora Najelski-Eigner has just joined us. So our full committee is here and we have two guest council people. So that being done, our next piece of business is public comment. So is anyone here? We don't have public hearings today. So is there anybody here for public comment? Can you take a look, Larry?
Yes, we do have one person with their hand up, Mr. Bruce Morris. You can unmute yourself.
You'll need to unmute yourself, Mr. Morris. There you go. And you have 3 minutes to speak, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Mr. Morris,
Still muted.
you need to unmute yourself.
There you go.
There you go.
No, didn't mean to have my hand up. I was just logging in. That's all. No comment at this point.
No comment.
Oh,
Great.
okay.
Alrighty. So then I'm going to close public comment and we'll take Mr. Morris off as a panelist at this time. Thank you, Larry. And the first order of business is to accept the minutes of April 19th. Do I have a motion for someone? Thank you, Mr. Livingston. Are there any changes other than one I'm going to make, which is Chairman Shanahan is referred to throughout the minutes, and so I preferred that it would say Chair Shanahan. If you could make that change universally. And Diane Loricella's name is misspelled. And is anybody here particularly adept at spelling Diane's last name?
I'll find it.
You'll
We
find
have her in prior minutes. I'll find it.
Yeah, that'd be great because she does speak often, and I take a stab at it, but I'm afraid that I may well.
I have that if you want it.
Oh, can you? Thank you, Broderick. You want
You're
to?
welcome. That's
make it-
LAURICELLA.
Thank you, Broderick.
Great.
You're welcome.
That change has been made. And one more thing to note is that Councilperson Darlene Young has joined us. So I think that I've acknowledged everybody who is on council who has joined us. All right, so our old business is to discuss and vote on the pesticide ordinance.
Hey, Lisa,
Yes.
we need to vote on the minutes.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So we've made those.
I'm
two-
sorry. I
Michael?
also just want to make one small change on page, it's page 4, but it's on page 7 on the PDF. It says, Mr. Goldstein asked why the committee has a member from the Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals, not the Planning and Zoning Board. It should be the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Thank you. I saw that too. Actually, I noted that. Thank you for finding that as well. So any other changes from any other committee members for the minutes? Seeing that,
Lisa, there is a misspelling on page 4. Similar is misspelled. Do you want me to change that?
yes, please.
Okay.
I hate misspellings. With all of those changes having been suggested, I'll take the vote now on accepting the minutes as amended. That's a yes. Okay. That is unanimous.
Abstention.
Oh, and then we have one abstention. Yes. One
Abstention.
abstention. Yes. Great. So 6 yes, 1 abstention because Mr. Hooperman was not able to make it at our last meeting. Okay, now we can turn our attention to discuss and vote on the pesticides ordinance. And I just wanted to say a few comments for the record so that the public knows a little bit about our process. This ordinance was shared with DPW, Rec and Parks, our Senior Conservation Officer, the Department of Health, and Oak Park Authority the golf organization, all for comment to go through the ordinance as we had written it, and we've made some adjustments and changes based upon their comments. And I first want to thank everybody for making this ordinance stronger and better suited to Norwalk and spending so much time with especially Mr. Livingston and I as we went through our process. We really hope that this ordinance will inspire regular citizens to do better on their own lawns. In doing the research for this ordinance, we read many of the pesticide labels that used to be used on city properties, some that are still used on golf courses and other places. Many of these pesticides are sold at hardware stores. And there's some serious chemicals in these pesticides. As Dr. Evans testified in March, some of these chemicals are associated with serious health risks in pregnant people, children, and pets, not to mention the rest of us. So we're hoping that all of Norwalk takes a look at and considers limiting the use or even eliminating the use of these types of chemicals on their own lawns. So with that said, we're going to turn our attention to the pesticide ordinance that we've been working on. And Tom and I are going to take turns just bringing everybody up to date on the changes since you've last seen this. And I guess I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Tom. The first couple of sections are pretty much the same. We did make a change in the definition section regarding the interdepartmental pest management team. And that was in conjunction and conversation with the Department of Health, the Chief Conservation Officer, DPW, and Rec and Parks. They had suggested who should be comprised of this committee. We sort of talked it all out among ourselves, and we decided that it would be best that the Chief of Operations would be the chairman of this committee, and everybody else would send designees. We also took out the Director of Transportation, Mobility, and Parking. It didn't seem like they had a relevant role. So Tom, I think the next section is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So that would be, well, just,
Did I miss anything else that we?
no,
changed?
just to note that your comment runs through in terms of who's going to get the reporting.
Yes.
You said the health department isn't going to Rexham Park, but that is in 4C. But I think what you really were talking about, a more significant changes in Section 5, the use of prohibited products. Listening to the concerns raised by Ken Hughes and others about dealing with poison ivy, particularly at schools, we provided an exemption for the use of a prohibited product to deal with poison ivy, provided that it was it's not used within 200 feet of a tidal wetland, watercourse, or wetland, and it's something they're using as of today.
Oh yeah, I miss that little spot there. Yep. Yes. And then the next section, I guess, that we have a change in would be exemption, right, Tom, or am I missing it? Did I?
No, that's it.
The golf course that we,
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I thought there was something else we did here. Now I look at this in terms of on school property. Anyway, no, that's fine. Yeah, okay. An exemption section 6 is a result of our conversations with Oak Hills. We talked through what they use and why. And the changes that were made here were based upon those discussions. For example, they needed to use restricted products in certain uses, and so they also didn't want to limit it to tees and greens, and so we took that out. We also provided they would follow the environmental principles for golf courses in the United States established by the U.S. Golf Association, which is provides guidelines for golf courses around the country, so it's well known. And they were also concerned about being able to limit their use of these products near water because they have bodies of water on the golf course. So, and they thought it was basically impossible to do that. I guess there are 3 greens. So what we did here was provided that they have to use their best effort to minimize the runoff into the water. Yeah, it's not an ideal solution, but it's sort of a compromise. As Lisa was saying, nobody was happy with this, but I think it's a way to preserve what's a very important asset to the city, yet recognizing the risk inherent in the use of pesticides. And this has been sent to them. This reflects their comments. So we believe they're good with it. So.
yeah, I mean, I think that we're happy that they're willing to, go through the restricted products. I mean, they will not use the prohibited products, which we were particularly concerned about. That included the neonics that are particularly deadly to bees. They also said no more Roundup and no more, I always go crazy when I try to pronounce this, chlorpyrifos. Can't pronounce it, but it's really bad. If you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't use it, I always say. So we're happy that they have agreed to take off the worst of the worst pesticides from their usual maintenance of the property. So as Tom Keegan knows, because he was in that meeting, everybody was unhappy, which means that it's probably a pretty good compromise. Then the last thing we were just going to say, I guess Tom picked it up already, that the reporting records now will go through Rec and Parks as the chair of the IMPT. And those are pretty much.
Well, one last one, which is the effective date.
Oh, the effective date, right. And that was really based also upon Oak Hills, because we wanted to, they buy their chemicals for the property a year to 6 months in advance. So we wanted to give them time to use up the chemicals that they purchased for this season and give them, ask that they do better next year. Anything else we forgot, Tom?
That's it.
So any questions from the committee about this? What we'd like to do is take it to public hearing next month if, unless people have questions or comments that they'd like to have heard.
It seems like it's in really great shape.
Thank you. I think this is something that our city can be really proud of, that the city is committed to not using these really tough chemicals. Broderick's got his hand up. Broderick, do you want to be heard on the pesticides?
It would help if I unmuted myself. I just want to follow up on the pesticides that they use. It's in fire code as well, where the material safety data sheets, they have to submit them to us, and there's certain thresholds of chemicals they can store. They've been in compliance with that. It doesn't sound like this has anything to do with what you guys are doing, but for us, pesticides would fall under our realm, so to speak, jurisdiction. That's all. I just wanted to let you know.
Oh, good to know. I guess I could imagine that the storage is really important of these, really powerful chemicals.
Absolutely. They have a cargo container out there near their maintenance shed, and it does have the proper venting. It has the vents on top. They're within their range, and they have the MSDS sheet on site if we request it. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, thank you. When I read, I actually read every single label of everything that Oak Hills uses. So it does have a lot of information about the storage and the importance of storage and keeping the storage away from waterways and things like that. So if you have leaks, all of that kind of stuff. So it's reassuring to hear that you inspect it and that it's appropriately done. That's good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So is there further discussion among the committee or questions from committee members about where we are before we take it to public hearing or vote to take it to public hearing? Mr. Keegan.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Are we going to talk about the possibility of a financial impact on Parks and Rec, their budget, because they're going to have to change the chemicals they use, as well as the golf course, and how that may fit in?
No, I don't. I don't think that that's something that we plan to discuss. No. I think that the city has been pretty cautious about using these chemicals in the first place. So I don't think that there's a massive change for the city. And for Oak Hills, if we're going to talk about economic benefits and detriments, there is a detriment for them using these chemicals to our city.
Just on the city side, my understanding, Lisa, is the same as yours, which is they haven't been using these pesticides, and the only thing they were using was, I guess, the restricted product for that poison ivy, which we're allowing to keep using. So it doesn't sound to me there should be much additional cost based upon the discussions. Robert may have thoughts on that, but it doesn't sound like there's much. In terms of Oak Hills, they raised the subject, but they didn't really say anything. I mean, it's my recollection of the conversation was they said there might be costs, but I didn't get any sense of that anybody had quantified it.
Mr. Stowers, I saw you unmute yourself. Would you like to be heard?
Yeah, I don't think there's any costs that we have anticipated, any additional costs. Like Mr. Livingston said, if there's a cause for to get an exemption to use pesticides against toxic weeds, then we would poison ivy, poison hemlock, or noxic weed. Then we would go to the committee. But other than that, I don't think there's any economic impact, at least that we can see right now. But we because we'll keep the data and we'll keep the reporting going, so we'll be able to assess it and evaluate it.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Mr. Hoovelman.
Just a question, was there ever any discussion about phasing away, like with the poison ivy exemption, that looking for a product that eventually to replace and phasing that product out? And is there any mechanism or trigger within this to be able to do that?
We have been talking about that, and sort of the mechanism that we think of, and maybe Mr. Stowers can hop in, is, if you're going to use a restricted product, you have to go to the committee, and then the committee will give you permission or not permission. So as hopefully the alternatives, the organic alternatives become better and stronger, those can be used instead. And embedded in the language, Tom and I put something to the effect that, let's see. Reasonable attempts have been made to remediate the condition using organic land management practices, and those practices have failed to remedy the situation. So it's sort of built into the system that, you've looked, there's not better stuff, but as time goes on, hopefully they'll look and there will be better stuff.
For the record, that was in section 4, subsection A, subsection 2.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think ever since glyphosate and the agent in Roundup has brought so much attention to this. I think we've been looking for alternatives ever since then to act against toxic weeds. So we'll continue to look, and as exemptions come to the committee, we'll be continue to look for alternatives that will come on the market.
That's fantastic to hear. Thank you so much for reassuring us about that, because that's exactly what we hope that this ordinance will do, and so that it has the flexibility so that we can keep getting our practices better as we can know to do better.
Thank you.
Other questions? Other concerns? Otherwise, we can take a vote to take it to public hearing. Can I have a motion for that? Mr. Livingston makes a motion to take this pesticide ordinance to public hearing at our next meeting. All in favor? That appears to be unanimous. Thank you. And thank you so much to Mr. Livingston, who once again held the pen on this and sat in on every single meeting we had on this. I didn't make him read all the pesticide labels. I did that because I only wanted one of us to stay up late at night and stay up all night worrying. But so that's my job, just to worry about what's on the labels. Anyway, thank you all. Our next item on the agenda is new business, and we're going to discuss and vote on the Firefighter Safety Building Marking System Sign Ordinance, which is a really long name. So I'm going to turn this over to Brian, who has done all the work on this. And I'm glad that Broderick's here to help explain what we need. I'm going to mute myself so it's not loud behind you.
Brian, you want to start off with
Brian should start off.
Yeah.
Sure. So, excuse me, Broderick came to us to let us know of a issue and a safety issue as it pertains to firefighters when they're entering non-residential buildings. Specifically, there's a sign that can be placed at the front part of the building that will identify to firefighters. They'll be able to read it and understand the construction type of the building that they're entering. And that's important because it lets them know how long the fire's been burning. It will let them know how long they have inside before potentially the building is unsafe. This is something that is not expensive. It's something that the owners of the buildings can go to the fire marshal's office and figure out exactly what should be placed outside. And then it can be done at a relatively inexpensive amount. And I believe only one sign is necessary, but
yes,
this is inserted into 72-5. And this would be subsection D, and it's talking about numbering of buildings. And so, as you can see from the addendum to the ordinance, it gives you an example of what the firefighters would be looking at if and when they entered a building with these things up. And just so everyone was aware of where we
Can
got.
you hold on one second? Someone's joining our call with Josh's name on it, and I'm not sure who that is. And
Sure.
Do we know who that is, Larry? Josh, do you know who that is?
Brenda Penn Williams.
Oh gosh, thank you. I don't know if she's to be a panelist or she should be a participant. Josh,
Well,
do you?
I'm a participant, but I just got this. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Josh, is that your understanding?
Yeah. I mean, this is not a public hearing. So yes, as a participant, that's correct.
She's a participant. Okay, so if Larry would move her, that would be terrific. So sorry, Brian, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. The more the merrier. And
Yep.
so just so everyone was aware of where we got this from. It's from the Connecticut Fire Safety and Prevention Code. It's Annex E, and it's from the 2018 edition. If I got anything wrong or if I missed something, Broderick, please let me know. Let everyone know.
Copy that. No, you covered it. In the front of the building, if they don't have a fire department connection, some of the buildings, you know, you don't want the sign on the front of your building, but if you have an FDC, it's going to go near the sprinkler system, which already does have signs for automatic sprinklers and dry pipe in parking garages. So the buildings without the FDC, yes, that would go in the front. This is not adopted in Connecticut. What I've done with Brian was to tag it into our ordinance in Chapter 72 for numbering lettering of buildings, which is in my jurisdiction. I spoke to Joe Kingston of the State Fire Marshal's office, and he has no issues with the local ordinance doing this. And it's pretty straightforward. Floor and roof trusses have potential to collapse. Under fire attack, it depends on how long it's been burning, excuse me. And 10 minutes at high temperatures could force it to twist and push walls out. As an example, if you go into Costco and look up, you'll see a truss. So also any commercial building that has a drop ceiling where you can't see the truss. So fire can get up there, get hot before it reveals itself. It's done a lot of damage. So for our guys, there are 5 types of buildings: 1, 2, 3, 4, and regular wood frame, which is 5. The type 1 is fire resistive, then type 2 is non-combustible, then type 3 is ordinary, type 4 is heavy timber. The heavy timber holds up well under fire attack. But if you take a building like 25 Grand Street, over the years, it was a factory and there's heavy timber. There was a lot of renovations. Now it's a mix of construction. So we'd like to identify what a building like that would be. Ordinary construction tends to be your little malls and, you know, storefronts with apartments above. And those generally have problems with collapse as well. So that's pretty much it. It changes our tactics if we know how long the fire's been burning. Are we going to put someone on the roof? How are we going to attack this fire? So I think it's a pretty good way to keep not only firefighters safe, but the public. And that's pretty much it. Any questions, guys?
Yeah, Mr. Livingston, did you raise your hand? I thought
I did. I actually have, I mean, I think it's terrific. I think it's important. I think we should do it. I have some drafting suggestions, but I don't know if Mr. Hooverman had questions for Mr. Sawyer first.
David, do you have questions or do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
We'll go to the drafting.
The question I have is this something that the building owners have to comply with, or is this something
Yes.
that the city does for any commercial building?
No, this is something that they have to comply with.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tom?
No, see, let's let Nora go next because
Oh, I'm sorry.
drafting comments and Nora probably has a question.
I'm sorry.
Thanks. Hi, Broderick, and thank you for bringing this up. It certainly seems important. Just to, again, help us think about implementation, which might feed into some of Tom's drafting questions. Is this something that most building owners are going to know sort of off the top of their head, or is this going to require some research? And what is the sort of timeline you think this might take to be able to kind of get everybody in the city up to speed on this?
The property owners, the architects, building management, they'll know what type of building it is. Getting it off the ground, I would say next year, reasonably, get notices out. You talk to the BLTs and you talk to the Spinnakers, and I think they would be on board because it's also protecting their buildings.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they know what the buildings are, and I talked to Mr. Ireland over at the building department, and I may be able to get that information from Unicity through the permits to see what they are. So I'll have a list of what type buildings they are to confirm what their architects and building managers tell me.
Terrific, because that was actually one of my follow-up questions was, this also strikes me as having some risk factor if you have misinformation. So I was wondering about the ability
Right.
to kind of
We're
verify.
going to confirm.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Well,
And then a
thank you.
follow-up question on that, Broderick. I think you told me this when we were discussing this in general terms. The little tiles or whatever it is that will be placed outside the buildings are pretty reasonably priced, right? They're maybe,
They're about $40. And what we're looking at, it's only type 1 through 4. And if it only has the floor truss, it's an F. If it has floor and roof, it's F and R. They're weather resistant. They're responsible for them to replace them if something goes wrong. I think $40 when you're getting, a couple of grand for an apartment, single bedroom. I think that's nothing to them. I'm hoping. I'll keep my fingers crossed.
I mean, it's such an important safety issue. It's
Absolutely.
so important
Absolutely.
for both the inhabitants and also for our firefighters.
Absolutely. I think they'll understand that, and it protects their property. We can go and put the fire out.
It's safety for everybody. Mr. Hoovelman?
The ordinance right now reads that with the exception of single family buildings, but does this also, are we talking about anything above? So a 2-flat building, if there's 2 apartments in the building, if there's 4 apartments, how does that work in a residential zone? I mean, I understand the large apartment complexes, those types of buildings, yes, but when we're talking about homeowners that may have, an accessory apartment that's part of the building, how does this ordinance fit with that?
Well, David, we wouldn't be doing this with the type 5 buildings because it's a single family homes. Anything 3-family and up, where we cover those apartment buildings, and anything commercial.
Okay, so it's a 3-family building and up.
Correct.
Right.
Wood frame. When we show up on, I don't know, on Chestnut Street, we see a wood frame building. We know that it's wood frame. And with wood frame, you're generally going to either have platform construction or balloon frame. And balloon frame, fire starts in the basement, it goes up the sides and ends up in the attic. So we know that just by a lot of times looking, if there are no fire stops in those walls, they can go right into the attic and we cut a hole in the roof and do our thing. If it's platform, we may do horizontal ventilation and just go down, in the basement and put it out. So a lot of variables with type 5 construction.
Great, thank you. Mr. Livingston?
Yeah, so actually, David and Nora raised part of this, and it was really good questions. So there's first off, the language here says single family, like David pointed out, so we need to modify that, I think. But I'm a little concerned that, first off, as I said, I think this is a terrific idea and really important thing to do. The 2 things that I'm struggling with are implementation, and how do we get people to do this? And we can't just put it into place, because if we made it effective tomorrow, everybody's going to be out of compliance, right? So there needs to be some sort of phase-in period, I would think. And what is the penalty for not doing it?
Question to me, Tom?
Yeah, yeah. I guess anybody, you or Brian. I don't know.
Well, the penalty's already in our fire code. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brian. It's like $200 or a maximum of $1,000 or something like that. That's in Connecticut general statutes. I do believe we have the statutes in our local ordinance as well.
Yeah, I'm looking at, I'm sorry to interrupt, I'm looking at 72, and it says enforcement of this ordinance to be carried out by the fire marshal's office. Any person who violates this will be fined in an amount not exceeding $99. So I guess it is
Right.
covered there.
That falls under the fire code for the fees.
Okay, so that's what would be the penalty. So
And
what do you
phase-in.
think? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. And the phase-in, I've already started speaking to some of these folks. So that's why my January, there's no penalty if, they're not going to be in violation, because it's a new process and you have to give folks time.
Right.
But over a few months, I don't think it should be an issue. It's in my code. 29-305 of Connecticut General Statutes covers, we'll spit that out, it's a mouthful too. covers my jurisdiction in single and two-family dwellings. And it does smoke alarms, egress, or if I get a complaint, it's for.
I just don't want to have, half the city being in violation day one. So I think we need some sort of phase-in period.
That's built in as well.
Well, you said, how is it built in?
30 days. If we tell you to do something, you have 30 days to comply. It's generally for something like that, it's an easy compliance.
No, I'm sorry, Brian. I think it is an easy compliance, but I'm just thinking maybe technical and being very lawyerly here. I mean, if we pass this ordinance tomorrow and anybody doesn't have the sign the day after, they're in violation. So I just think we need
that would be up to the fire marshal's office to. I see where you're saying it'd be a violation based on the local ordinance, but for the fire marshal's office, it wouldn't be a violation for them.
I think we should put in.
Chairman Shanahan, is it possible to put in an effective date?
Yes.
Well, that's where I'm going.
Would
That's
you
where I'm
give
going.
people 6 months to whatever from a certain time period? I mean, you give people, I think 30 days doesn't seem like enough time, but you have an effective date.
Yeah.
No, that's where I'm
That's where
going.
Tom's going.
That's a good point.
I think we should just say something like that, just add some kind of effective date for at least section D.
I would add it in section 72-7 or, no, maybe well, we can either do in 72-7 or add a sentence here that in this.
Yeah, I was thinking add a sentence there, so it's not a confusing thing, because it's really, we're only making a change in that section, so just have a date effective by.
Apologies, I'm thinking like the fire marshal.
Yeah, no, I understand.
We're thinking like boring lawyers. Mr. Hooverman, do you have a comment about the effective date?
Well, no, yeah, just to sort of build on what Councilman Livingston just said, 72-7 is the compliance part of this. It would seem that the effective date should be in 72-7, and then and then I think just some clarity in. I'm not sure as I read this, I get confused reading it. So I'm wondering if we can, the clarity of exactly who needs to conform to this, I think is important.
I think your catch about single family versus like, we understand a single and double family. So
yeah, we just need to clear up exactly what that is. Because then, Broderick, you talked about, how the fire moves in different structures and those things, that we understand why that particular structure needs to conform to this. I think we just need to clear up some of that language.
Yeah, I saw.
And then maybe under 72-7C, how do you guys feel like making a new section C for?
Well, Lisa, what I was going to suggest was an A, adding a proviso at the end saying, provided, however, that section 72-5D shall be effective 6 months. Maybe just pick
put a date, yeah.
Maybe just put a date in, so it'll be effective, I don't know, whatever, November 1st.
I think that's the way to do it. So we'll make a change. And so does this make sense to you, Brian? Are you kind of taking notes on this?
I'm taking notes. Where do you want the effective date?
72-7A at the end, I would take out the period after 1988 and say the semicolon, provided, comma, however, comma, that section 72-5D shall be effective on November 1st, 2022.
That works for me.
Okay.
And then I go back up to, if I can just give a couple suggestions on the language.
Let's do it.
Hold on
Let's
one
do that
second. All right, so you're saying that's 72-7A. That's where that is. Okay.
Yeah.
Section 72-7.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Why don't you go forward with your thoughts and we'll see.
Yeah, and this is just because I was struggling when I was reading it, because what I would like to propose, and this is a two-part thing. One is just simply to take the first sentence and make it the second sentence. So it starts with the exception of blah, 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 all buildings have to have this sign, and then to say the firefighter sign provides the information. It's just clearer speaking and clearer I can't speak clearly, but it's written clearly. But to David's point, so with the exception of what are we saying? With the exception of single and double and two-family houses, structures?
Yes.
Broderick, what,
Yes.
Okay, so both of those structures, gotcha.
so with the exception of single and two-family buildings
Or structures.
or structure, and I would say all, take out the word other, buildings or structures should have the fire, blah, blah, blah. Take that first sentence, and I would change the this, the the, and then just one of the changes to be consistent with the way we're doing things now is on the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line from the bottom, and the 3rd line from the bottom where it says his or her designee, I would say his, her, or their designee in both places.
No, I'm going to call on you 1 second just to make sure that that Brian can catch up. Brian, tell us when you're caught up on them. We'll take Nora's comment.
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to find the other designee one.
It's the both at the end of the lines.
Yeah, 3rd and 5th from the bottom.
I see it. Hold on. All right, so I have, with the exception of single and two-family buildings or structures, all buildings or structures shall have this firefighter safety building marking system sign installed, and then change from his or her to his, her, or their designee.
Yeah, but did you put the first sentence as second following with the exception?
Yeah,
Okay,
with
got
the
it.
exception goes first, and then this firefighter safe,
Yeah,
I'm
and-
sorry,
yeah, yeah.
the firefighter safety building marking system sign provides, so that was the second, that's the second. Yeah, I got that.
Okay, so now that you're all caught up, now I'm going to let Nora go ahead. Have at it,
And
Nora.
mine's just a very quick point, Brian, which is to ask if maybe you can double check with the zoning regulations, or I'm sure there's a million other places where we refer to, single and 2-unit family or single and 2-unit dwellings. And I just, in a constant push to get our language as consistent as possible, if you can just double check.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, other comments from other committee members on this ordinance as amended? So what we would like to do is also take this to public hearing next month, because we do view this as a safety issue and we'd like to get it taken care of as soon as possible. So
So the only, Lisa, the only issue is that 72-7A was not on the agenda.
Oh, darn.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to just wait and get them both on at the same time. That probably makes more sense. We can bring it back, both of these, we could bring back 72.5D and new 72.7A at the next meeting. Just so it's,
Both at the same time. This is one of the ordinances that I don't have a hard time passing over the summer, because I think that everybody views it as a safety issue. So I guess we don't have a choice in the matter. We have to have it the way.
yeah, I think the cleaner way to do this is to bring them both back. It'll go to public hearing in July. It'll be in effect as of the last common council meeting in July, if you guys have one. And then it's just a matter of what everyone feels comfortable with us in terms of the effective date.
Yep.
Well, we're not changing the effective date, so it'd still be November no matter where we do this.
Okay, that's fine. I didn't know if we were pushing it back a month, whether that was going to matter.
I think the effective date would change.
Well, I mean, I think this still gives people August, September, October, November, gives them 120 days to apply, to comply. That feels fair. Nora, do you have your hand up for a question, or?
Yeah, I mean, but do we really need to be that purist about it? Can't we just say, except for single and double family dwellings, as of November 1st, 2022, the firefighter safety building marking system must be in place? I mean, why go through an additional month to put it in 72.7 as opposed to 72.5? I don't think it makes a significant enough difference that it really is worth the delay.
I'm not uncomfortable with that, but how does everybody else feel?
I'm okay with it. I was thinking about it, and my original reaction was to go with the language and compliance where people would see it. But then, of course, if they're looking at D, the new section, they're going to look there anyway. So yeah, that makes sense.
Let's
Right,
just do
so Nora,
I
what
think
was the
do it.
language? What was the language that you wanted?
I'm just thinking about where would be the easiest, but in I mean, it just, it
I mean, we
should
could put
be-
it as sentence at the end of the paragraph saying.
Yeah,
this will become
this shall be
effective.
effective.
The
Yeah,
second,
Right,
Yeah.
as of,
so
right.
this subsection shall be effective as of November 1st, 2022.
Right, and that way there's clear notice too.
Yes.
It's all in one place, and people will pay attention to this. Maybe the press will pick up that we're doing this, and we don't have to get.
That's fine. Then there's no issue.
Okay, great. Because I'd rather.
I'm
once you-
working on the
Thank you,
press.
Nora.
release.
Good solution, Nora. I like practical solutions.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so is there?
Clean is good, but done is better, right?
That's what I say.
Mhm.
All right, so is there a motion on the floor to take this amended firefighter safety building marking system sign ordinance to public hearing? Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. So it's all in favor. That is unanimous. All right, we are done and dusted on that. All right, thank you very much, Broderick, for bringing this to our attention. We feel a whole lot better about, getting this moving along. You've got your hand
Thank
up.
you, Broderick.
Hey, I want to thank everyone. This is really good for the community. Really appreciate it. And have a great night.
You as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you all for your
Good night.
work.
Thank you, Brian.
Good night,
Thank you.
Broderick.
Keep us safe, Broderick.
Good night.
Okay, our last new business is to discuss and vote on a cannabis ordinance. I'm not sure if we're going to get to the voting part, but what we really want to do is to introduce our cannabis ordinance. And Josh and I are going to, I'm going to turn it over to Josh in 1 minute, but what I want to emphasize to everybody is that this ordinance, what we're working on tonight, is pretty much the mechanism for the city to collect the funds from the state and retailers, that 3% surtax that people who buy cannabis products have to pay, and then how those funds will be held within the city, and then the mechanisms for it to go. There's a lot of policy that's underlying all of those things about how the monies are going to be spent and whatnot and where they fall. Some part of that will be covered by Mr. Kleppin's presentation about regulation. Other things will be covered by Mr. Daniels, who's here tonight to talk about the guidelines about spending. But what we're talking about tonight really is the ordinance, which is the mechanism for the collection, holding, and disbursement. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Goldstein and Mr. Keegan, who have really held the pen on this ordinance. And I really appreciate all the hard work you guys have done. You spent hundreds of hours, it feels as though, on this topic. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really do, before we get going, this has been a team effort, and my partner in this, Tom Keegan, has been totally essential. And we've spent many times spitballing ideas and working through problems, all while Tom seems to know 50 other people who show up to walk up to him while he's on the phone. So I'm always remiss to say that we're losing a pretty popular guy in Norwalk in a month or so, but it's been great to work with you on this. So just to set the stage a little bit before we get into it, this is a sort of an initial but comprehensive presentation of sort of the lay of the land as the city's sort of initial draft of its approach to dealing with retail cannabis. So for those of you who are listening or who may watch this on YouTube later, this is not a finished product. This is an initial project, and this is sort of our draft as we see it right now, but there will be changes before this hopefully gets passed. So just to set the stage, last summer, SB 1201, this is an act concerning responsible and equitable regulation of adult use cannabis, was signed into law by Governor Lamont. This is, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a 300-page sprawling bill that does a lot of different things. We're focusing on a relatively small subset of it tonight, which has to do with sort of municipal powers and prerogatives when it comes to cannabis. But as Lisa aptly put it, really, the ordinance really does a few things. Just to answer a question that is probably on everyone's mind right off the bat, in terms of revenue projections, the answer is no one knows anything. We have no idea exactly how much the state is going to get in terms of total tax revenue and municipal revenue derived from that. I can tell you though, Connecticut, the state's Office of Fiscal Analysis projected that in fiscal year 2022, and again, just to backs up this a little bit, there is a state licensing process that's going on right now that is separate and apart from the municipal process. From every expectation and everything I've read about, I've read and I've spoken with people about this, those licenses are expected to start going through effective late this year, early next year. So that, to keep that in mind. So there won't be retail sales of cannabis in the state of Connecticut until late this year, early next year. But in terms of revenue projections, the State Office of Fiscal Analysis said that in the first fiscal year, it'll be about $1 million in municipal revenue, but by 4 years in, there will be $18 million that will get split by all the municipalities that are engaged in the sale of retail cannabis. And of course, that municipal revenue comes through a part of the state law, which has a 3% municipal sales tax, which means that any sale of cannabis, retail cannabis that happens in the Norwalk, sort of the jurisdiction of Norwalk, there is that 3% of every purchase comes back to the city. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We as a city and cities across the Connecticut are beginning to figure this out. Some have taken sort of a patchwork approach. Many have sort of figured this out as mostly, or really are in the process of figuring this out as primarily a zoning issue. Something that I've been working on and I pitched, and I think with the help of Tom and Lisa King in the mayor's office and Tom Keegan, we're sort of going to present to you tonight what is a two-pronged approach. The first prong, which Steve Kleppen is going to, and Deanna are going to talk about, which is the zoning related aspects of this, which covers sort of the normal zoning and as well as sort of eligible locations. And I'm going to let, and Steve and Deanna from the health department talk about this in detail. And the second part of it is the ordinance that we're going to discuss tonight, which, as Lisa said, goes over both enforcement of cannabis, but also the mechanism for how we are going to deal with the funds that we eventually would receive from this municipal sales tax. So that was a little lengthy, but with that, I'm going to kick it over to my friend Steve Kleppen, who could talk, and Deanna, who can talk about the zoning and sort of the health department's work with planning and zoning. Steve.
Good evening. Thanks for the invite tonight. And I don't know how you want to proceed. I did send out a little while ago to
Chair, his audio is
I was gonna
not
say,
good.
Yeah.
maybe what you ought to do, maybe we can't see you, Stephen. Maybe it's better just to be dark and see if that improves it. Sometimes it does.
Otherwise, call in the number, but we'll let you know how your audio is.
Still not good.
Sign out and sign back in, maybe.
Or switch your microphone. Maybe it's on the camera or on the computer. I don't know.
He's doing the old turn it off, try it again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost always if you can unplug something, it works better. Give him a
It's
minute.
it's the reboot button that fixes everything.
Why?
He said he's logging off and trying to come back in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did the committee all get the memo that he showed, or the map? We could probably share that. I think maybe share that screen so people have the benefit of that.
Yeah, Brian,
that
if you
here.
could, yeah, and Stephen and Deanna, yeah, I mean, they'll talk about the map. What you'll
Yeah.
see, it'll show sort of the eligible sites with some factors weighed in. Not to speak for Steve, but hold on.
That's the map.
That's the map, and Deanna, if you want to, while Steve is sort of in progress, kind of talk a little bit about how your department helped with sort of figuring out some of what we call the sensitive sites, and how we began to formulate this map. I know we're doing this a little out of order, but if you wouldn't mind picking up the baton, that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
We can. You sound good.
Okay, good. So thank you for the opportunity to speak on this and participate and collaborate on this. I want to thank one of my staff members, Aniela Fignon, who's our public health program associate. She has done a lot of research on cannabis and health, and just thinking about from a public health perspective what we should be considering when when we're regulating this. And so one of the things we looked at is what are the risks for cannabis and how do we protect those most at risk from that are most at risk from it. And so one of the things that we really looked at is just buffers from different locations. So we looked at youth serving facilities, schools, rehab recovery centers. She did research on, what are those sensitive sites that we don't want a cannabis retail facility to be right next to. And so we looked at guidance from the American Public Health Association. We looked at what other cities are doing. We looked at a model ordinance that had been put together by the Public Health Institute of California. And so what we had from a public health perspective is really, if we can, we want to see 1,000 feet from schools, youth serving facilities, and rehab recovery centers. And there's also other sites that we worked with Steve Coppin and his team on, for 500 feet. So some healthcare institutions and others. And I don't know if Steve is on yet, but that's sort of the main summary.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, so much better.
Okay, sorry, my laptop didn't like what I was doing for whatever reason.
So Steve, Deanna just did a brief sort of explanation of the health department's work with your department on the map. Brian, if you wouldn't mind zooming in on the map so people can see it a little closer up. And Steve and Deanna, take it away.
So I don't know where you left off, Deanna. I'm happy to jump in and just ramble unless you want to cover something else.
Sure, I'll just to catch you up. I just mentioned some of the research that the health department has done related to this topic and the guidance from some of our national partners and what others are doing in terms of wanting 1,000 feet from certain sensitive sites and what those sites are, and how we worked with you with developing that list of facilities, and then how your team took the lead on mapping.
Sure. So, I mean, first and foremost, I think while we have that list, I think before we, take the next step, it probably would be a good idea for, between my end and Deanna's end, that we both kind of take another look at those lists and make sure we've captured as much as we think we've captured, and as well as work with you guys on that to make sure the list is comprehensive, because, we want to just make sure we're as accurate as possible. So there are some things to consider in terms of, location, assuming that's the direction that the city wants to go for allowing the establishments. There's things you can regulate. Obviously, the state legislation allows for 3 retail establishments in the city. Is there, a preference on a distance separation between those types of establishments, or should they be dispersed to different parts of the city? My feeling is that it probably would be appropriate to keep those on, the main arteries as much as possible. Obviously, I think there'll be other things to consider, particularly parking. What's going to happen? I think when they open, there's going to be a big rush to go to these facilities. I think as the market kind of stabilizes and, the fad wears off, I think that will tamper down. And, if the market, adopts more of these uses over time, I think that, there'll be other options for places for people to go, and they won't be the crush at, at any given location. I'd be a little nervous about just opening one and just allowing one, because I think then everybody's going to go to that one. And I think that, that's going to create a rush at that individual standpoint. The legislation does allow you as a municipality to require that the applicant provide additional policing when they open to make sure that, that they can handle the traffic. I'd be concerned on some of the smaller sites that are in the eligible zones that they don't have that, overflow parking, where if you're in like a larger plaza, that larger plaza has other uses there. So there's that shared parking aspect, and usually there's, ample parking at those sites. Now, will those types of facilities allow that type of retail to mix into, where else they would want to have their establishment. Some other things to think about would be, signage. The regulations from the state do allow you to regulate the signage, and it's not, I think one thing people think about a lot is when we have those kind of, the head shops that pop up where they're, they have just, merchandise displayed all over the windows. They have lots of signage. It's kind of, not the best look. This business is regulated a lot more. The other aspect that we need to think about at some point is the cultivators. Typically, when we get uses like that, like maybe we have a distillery in the city, we have a brewery in the city, we have an indoor hydroponics growing for like artisan lettuce and those kind of things. We treat that like manufacturing, and it's allowed to go in those zones. I would imagine, so long as the manufacturer is not allowed to sell to as a retail component to it from their sites, that the allowing it as consistent with manufacturing would probably make the most sense. I think that's kind of like a nutshell kind of look at things. Thinking along your timeline is that, once you guys think about some of these variables a little bit, we can tighten up and craft the actual regulation, to line it up with what you guys are thinking, because we may have discussed this previously, we may not have. Obviously, there'll be a public hearing process as this works through your group. And then ultimately, if the Planning and Zoning Commission adopts some legislation, that they're going to have to hold their public hearings as well. So there's going to be multiple bites at the apple for the public to comment on, and if they have concerns about location or whatever. So that just kind of throwing that out.
All right, I see Mrs. Councilwoman Young's hand is up. So Darlene, if you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just help orient me with this map? I should know where all these places are, what part of town. So can you just give me a description of where the eligible lots and the retail eligible sales are?
And it might be
That
good
was
to
my
bring it back
question.
to make it a little bit smaller if we could.
Yeah, if you could do that, yeah, that would be great.
There you go.
Yeah. So from what you see on the map is kind of majority of the areas where the city allows retail/commercial activity. And those parcels are all outlined in yellow. That might be a little tough to see some of those at the scale we're looking at, but if you think about it, following like a east-west corridor and a north-south corridor, starting at the top of the map, that's kind of where the main Ave, Route 7 connector runs down through there. And then running east-west is obviously the Route 1 corridor. And then working south, then you're into Sono following West Ave, Wall Street, then down into South Norwalk by the train station. Also, East Avenue is highlighted on there because it does allow retail. And there are other spots. Rowayton allows retail. You have a little spot in Cranberry, and Silver Mine up at the tavern technically allows retail, but obviously I think that would not those areas wouldn't be the most appropriate areas to allow that kind of retail. So the green that's on there is the areas where we've already buffered. So Deanna had mentioned there is separation distances proposed from certain types of uses. So those green parcels that are on there are the ones that are technically eligible as of today based on the separation distances that we've outlined. And I'd say the largest kind of concentration is along Westport Ave or Connecticut Ave, and then all up along the main Ave spine. And just thinking in my head, it would be best if these were located near easy access to the main corridors. People can get off the highway to get in and out. If the traffic's going to be coming from areas outside of the city.
Mr. Hooverman, do you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, is it going to be possible for members of the committee and the council to get a copy of this map? I realize that it's a work in progress right now, but I'd love to be able to actually
I can send that around. That's not a
look at
problem.
it. Great, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we can send you the spreadsheet that has the actual properties that are on there as well, the ones that are green highlighted mapped, so you can.
That would be
kinda see
great
what
as
that
well
is.
to sort of get a little bit clearer picture of this. Thank you.
Ms. Revolus?
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering, why would you say, like, for example, on the upper right, that would be a bad area? I think especially with people coming in and out, being more on the lining of Norwalk instead of internally in Norwalk for traffic and so on basis would actually make sense. Why would you think that wouldn't be beneficial?
Oh, so I think what the area that I was talking about, and I'm not sure who's working the cursor, where we were not on the same
Sorry.
location.
Okay, I'm sorry. So can you clarify where you would think it's not?
Yeah, I'm pointing at my screen and I know that's not helping anybody.
Probably.
So in the far upper left of the map, you can see that green little, yeah, there you go.
Oh, that little spot? I was thinking more
Yeah.
the big spot there. Okay, I
No,
could see what
no.
you mean.
So, and then there's another area that where the Cranberry Market is. That's another area that allows retail. I can't see it bounce on the scale I'm looking at. I can't see it on the map. That's another one I was thinking about. So those are kind of the outliers that do allow retail. So some of the things I would suggest, just thinking about it on my end, would be where people can get in and off the highway quicker or along the main corridors, to me, makes the most sense to locate those. And then
The reason, sorry, not to cut, but the reason why I'm asking that is, again, I think, not that it's bad, and I understand the money that's going to come in it, but we are going to experience traffic of people coming in and out. And again, how does that relate to the residents that live within? So if it, especially an idea that has been spoken to me before, with our surrounding areas saying no, it would actually make a better sense to border Norwalk instead of being internally. I'm just giving out an idea, because we're going to get people who are in locations who said no, but will run into Norwalk. I just trying to get an understanding of like how, like an for lack of better words, over policing or the restrictions will daunt on residents here, but the way people come in and out without any type of penalty or anything like that would be increased. So I think for me, just in looking at it, to put it in a more of a bordering situation, that we don't incur a lot of traffic into the residents, so the residents themselves don't get heavily monitored for this when we're really having majority outside patrons coming in. You see what I'm saying?
yeah, and I think we're kind of thinking along the same lines in terms of access. I agree.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Other questions for Mr. Kleppen or Ms. Demore? All right, I guess we could move on, Josh, if you'd like. Oh, Mr. Hooverman, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have another question. So when we're looking at this, Steve, is this establishment is going to then be based on the square footage? You're looking at one of these properties, like say one of the properties along Westport Avenue, and it's going to be based on square footage, which is going to then impact parking, correct? Based on, patronage size, those types of things. Or does this have, do the cannabis establishments have a different requirement for that than our current zoning codes?
So that, I think, optionality is available. You can, my gut reaction is to park them at retail, the same retail ratio we use now. You could do a larger, higher percentage if you felt it was appropriate. My thinking is that, like I said, I think when these first open, there's going to be a big rush, but I think that levels out over time. I think to protect yourself along that front, you could require the establishment to be on a larger parcel, so there's more parking available. Than I'm thinking, like just going up and down the Route 1 corridor, there's some locations where you have like your big anchor store lots where there's hundreds of parking spaces. And then you might have a small lot where they have 30 spaces. If it's in one of those small lots with 30 spaces, that cannabis establishment might overwhelm that parking lot for a little while when they first open, whereas the larger lot can absorb that extra parking.
Those ratios, though, our Norwalk is to establish within our own code. That's not being dictated to us by the state, correct?
No, it's, yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
I think Dominique and Nora have their hands up.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nora, if you let's go next.
Sure. My question is really less about the ordinance per se and more just understanding how this is likely to work in practice. I'm presuming that folks who are seeking to cite these establishments, particularly given that there's a limited number of them, are likely to approach you, Steve, or Jessica, or how do we think that people are going to be sort of negotiating these locations? I'm not, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, but I'm assuming that people are not going to sort of look at this map and pick a location without a sort of having any communications before it kind of gets going. I'm just trying to get a sense of how this is likely to play out in practice. Are you going to have the ability to steer people, to make suggestions, to, you know, raise issues about lot size or whatever else before they get sort of down the road negotiations?
Well, the way I could, like, so right now people are reaching out to myself, Sabrina Church, and Jessica. So all three of us are getting inquiries about, you know, interest in what Norwalk's doing. So just for, you know, discussion purposes, say this was the, Norwalk allowed 3 establishments, and we said you can go in any one of these green parcels that are shown on this map. So then basically it would be just going through the application process. So I think when you put those kind of confines around where they can go, that will further limit those available parcels. And then it most likely is going to be through a special permit process with the Planning and Zoning Commission, which requires a public hearing. So then they have the ability to look at the application from a a neighborhood aspect as well as like a traffic aspect to make sure that this particular site doesn't get overloaded by the crush of what could happen.
Is that, did you hear what you needed to hear, Nora, or should we?
Yeah, no, I think so. I'm just, it's as we always talk about, I'm just trying to think about the balance between putting things in ordinance and, sort of unnecessarily being overly specific and tying hands. So thank you. It's just helpful to think about a little bit.
Yeah, just to remind everybody what Josh has been talking about, we're going to have zoning regulations, and we're going to have an ordinance, and a lot about the place and what it looks like and whatnot will come through the zoning regulation. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. And so just to be clear, since the map, I see we're going to have it in our inboxes, but some of the streets around the Wall Street area, those are shaded green. Is that right, Steve? So it's not like they're big parcels, but these could be like storefronts.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I can't see the scale.
Oh, no, it's good. Oh, good. Oh, I see it now. Yeah. Okay. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about what Nora and some folks have been saying about traffic patterns, because I know we just sorted the Chick-fil-A drive-through situation, or is in progress. Now McDonald's is trying to do the same. And I know some of these establishments in Massachusetts, for example, I've seen have through the pandemic curbside. So I'm thinking, is that something we're thinking about, is how to handle whether or not we're going to have massive traffic issues if there's not parking, like say Wall Street, like where we're going to direct people to park, but then also the curbside aspect, like if they want to dispense with like pre-orders and curbside, what you think the public safety piece would be for that, especially with traffic.
Yeah, that's a good question. And just looking at the map, it doesn't look like the Wall Street area has eligible parcels. And I think that a lot of that's going to do with, I know there's a couple churches in that area. So I bet you when you get those buffers, they kind of overlap and eliminate a lot of those potential areas. But I think that second part of your question comes in when we get into the specific location and the specific application. So that's kind of how we handle, like the more recent one was there was a Popeyes and then a Jimmy John's, and we got very specific on how they were internally functioning their traffic and how they were handling pickups and queuing of the vehicles. So that's a little hard to answer without having a specific site in mind. That's fair. That's fair. But that is great to remind me of, like, yeah, the Jimmy John's as well. And then there's no drive-through legally allowed for this, just to be clear, right? I have not seen that addressed. Okay, I don't think there's, but I don't want to put that out there because I'm not sure. So I'll defer to the legal experts on this particular state law. But I haven't read it in a while. But I don't know. Josh, do you have any recollection about that?
I don't believe there is, but I can do a quick search. But again, I think a lot of, as Lisa aptly said, a lot of these kinds of questions are not going to show up in an ordinance that the Common Council is going to consider. This is going to show up as an amendment to the zoning regulations.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you.
Yep, we're just taking this advantage to get people's attention, to give them a preview about what maybe would go into the regulation and why there's two distinct processes. Councilperson Young, it looks as though you have a question.
Yes. So have we figured out how many we are going to have? I know we can have a maximum of 3, right? But then I heard you say, Steve, that the applicant will or has some say in where their site will be.
Based on what the zoning regulations ultimately allow. So I kind of think, while
because for me, I'm thinking, so if we have 3, I mean, I think you have to think about, as everyone's been talking about, traffic patterns and having them spread out enough. But clearly, I think 1 in each section. I don't think we want any one area to be overburdened with traffic and the like.
Yeah, and Darlene, there's also the issue of the streetscape eligibility. So having more than 1 in a single community is disadvantageous for that reason too.
But so what would that process then look like if you have applicants that come in and I'm the first one that comes in and I pick one site? So then the other applicant should not be able to move into that area that I'm in, right? That someone chooses, right?
Yeah, so that's just how you craft the final code itself. So I agree with Ms. Shanahan. There's and Mr. Goldstein. There's 2 processes, but I think it's probably better for the Planning and Zoning Commission ultimately is if a lot of some of these variables at least get discussed preliminarily with this group, and then through the public that in that forum. So that way you can get a sense of, well, we don't want to see, to your point, we don't want to see all 3 of them clustered right along within a half mile of each other. We want to see, them spread out, and we can craft a language that way. Just when you get the map document, I'll make sure that you get the other information I put together with kind of like the list of variables for things for you guys to consider. And then however it shakes out, we can craft the language accordingly. It's like, I think right now we're pretty close to like a framework of like a menu of options of things to like legislate. And then what the final wording is, we can work out over the next couple of months.
Okay, thanks.
Darlene, you have your questions answered?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Livingston, your hand's up next.
Yeah, thanks. Steve, just to be clear, and I know this is a separate zoning exercise, but you're not saying here that this is where these green areas are where it's going to be. What you're saying is these are the possible places they might be, but the zoning commission is going to refine that and designate certain areas from among these green areas. Is that correct?
Correct. Right now, these are like if you didn't put any restrictions,
right,
aside from the separation distances that Deanna and her team helped identify, those green parcels are the ones that are eligible. Now you can further restrict it off that.
Right. I just want to be clear so people don't think this is automatically where they're going to be. This is your first cut at what would be a starting point. Right. I just want to be clear on that. Thanks.
Yep.
That's very clarifying. Thank you. Mr. Hoovelman.
Yeah, I just want to also, forgive me, it's been a while since I read the bill and I don't remember the particulars. I know that we can have 3 facilities. That includes a cultivation or a manufacturing facility as well as dispensary within.
David, the limit for 3 is for retail. That does not
It's free
include
retail.
micro. Yes, David.
Okay.
So it's 1 per 25,000 citizens. So Norwalk is a city of 90,000, which means that we get up to 3. Now
Right,
that's
I understand.
that does
So, but
not.
that's the retail dispensing facilities.
Yes.
So
that
we
is
could
not
still
micro
also,
cultivators.
we could still also have a cultivation facility. We could have a manufacturing facility. We could have a number of other facilities in Norwalk as well.
That's correct.
What are there limits to those amounts of facilities within any one municipality based on population size?
I have not seen that.
I don't think so, David, but we can track that down. We can figure that out for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question, David. That was very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the cultivators, it's going to be, my guess is it's going to be something you won't even know they're there. You'll see if we get one, it's going to be a big warehousey type building, and it will have no discerning marks.
Which I understand, but I'm raising, this gets into a larger issue, a public safety issue, and a question that becomes, you're talking about a 15,000 square foot facility that is manufacturing cannabis in some form. So we're talking about a public safety issue at that time as well. And I want to make sure that we're thinking in those terms when we're talking about 3 retail facilities is one thing, but if we're also talking retail facilities, dispensary, manufacturing facilities, cultivating facilities, I want us to make sure that we're being conscious of all of that as we have this discussion.
Great, thank you. Ms. Ayers?
Thank you, Chair. I know that I believe Mr. Clippen said that the physical, how the locations are going to physically look is more of a zoning concern and not an ordinance concern. But I want to bring to this body this topic. When vaping first came out, particularly Juul, that company, younger residents, children were eager to try it because of the way it was packaged, the way it looked, and the way it tasted. My concern is if there is no regulation on what these things are going to look like, are we going to be then enticing children or others, it could not just be children, to participate in these things? So I know that's a regulation that against the law and stuff like that, but as someone who works with kids every day, it needs to be said that we need to really be thinking about how these stores are going to look, not only where they are going to be.
No,
because
this is a super important point.
They could be in I'm just saying, they could be on Connecticut Avenue, but if they look like a candy store or they look like something very trendy, that's going to get residents that should not be there attracted to that area. So that's my first concern. My second concern is if I'm looking at the map as I'm trying to struggle and figure out neighborhoods, we should do better. I really should know where everything is in the city, but I don't. I see that if we're looking in the northern part of the map that is presented, that is a bigger green area. And if I understood the conversation earlier, and maybe I didn't, but if I think I did understand the conversation earlier, as long as they are not in a place that hasn't been okay, so as long as they're in one of those green places, that we would allow them to go. But to me, that's not spread out in the city. That's really northern Norwalk. That's condensed to 4 or 5, if my mapping is correct, neighborhoods. So why are we allowing for this type of industry to be heavily placed in 4 or 5 neighborhoods? It's the same argument that we have heard from our colleagues from South Norwalk, which says, we don't think that this should be in South Norwalk. I am also going to argue and say that I don't think that in those neighborhoods at the top of the map there should be more than one in that neighborhood. That's a lot for a neighborhood to digest.
Great,
I
that's
can-
helpful. Does anybody want to speak to Ms. Ayer's question? Or
I think I can.
No, Steve, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. I think just to answer that quickly, the reason why there all those parcels, green parcels, are kind of concentrated there is just based on where all the parcels or all the uses we've identified as sensitive uses. There aren't any within that buffer zone through those parcels there. That's why they're just the way it works out. So if you looked at, like we talked about Wall Street, or even South Norwalk, if you think about South Norwalk, there's so many schools and churches in kind of a short area that they kind of, when you put the buffer, whether it's 500 feet or 1,000 feet around each one of those, you eliminate all those parcels in the yellow from being eligible to be, to hold one of those. A couple of things, just keep in mind, the green just represents the zone that allows it. So the one, if you could point to where the DPW and garage is there on the map, that just to show you that. So technically the DPW garage is in a zone that allows for technically somebody to put in retail. But that doesn't mean that we allow retail there just, by use. So keep that in mind. While it looks like there's a lot of parcels in certain spots, some of them are actually just not going to ever, materialize for that type of use. And regarding the aesthetic of the building itself, there are very strict regulations on signage with this use that are within the statutory language. So as I made reference to earlier, you see some of those, and there's a couple still, I think, in South Norwalk where they sell, the pipes and the bongs and all that kind of paraphernalia. There isn't any regulation around that outside of what's in our existing sign regulations now. So the cannabis legislation does really restrict the aesthetic part of the building. So you can't have like a pot leaf on the side of the building and with neon arrows pointing to the shop or anything like that. It's going to be a pretty muted aesthetic.
And can I just follow up with what you said? I'm sorry, Diana. Steve, again, using the example of the Juul. If you're familiar with the Juul, which is a vaping thing, it's just the word Juul. It's just the word Juul. It's nothing that, if you did not know what it was, there's nothing that is going to make you know what it was if you did not know what it was. But we have to be mindful of pop culture and what that says. So I get that there might not be smoke coming out the top of the building or a marijuana leaf waving as a flag. But with millennials and people coming after that generation, it's not just the obvious. It's more than just the obvious. So again, not to argue that point, but I want it to be said that it's not just, it's not a leaf there, so they're not gonna know. It's more than just that. The Juul is just the word Juul. It's just letters. But in pop culture, children know what that means. So that just makes me a little nervous. But thank you for the response.
Sure.
Nicole, if you're done, I'm going to ask Diana to speak next, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ms. Revolus?
And thank you guys. Just to double back on one of the things you just said, I was like, well, where did you find a place in South Norwalk there's not a church? So you made me laugh a little bit because there's a church everywhere. Secondly, signage too. We do have stipulation on signage, but we have people who break those stipulations very easily. Right now, we have signage that is too close to schools. We have signage on our highways that are in violation of like youth seeing it. Like we have people who are putting up signs who really don't care about the stipulations to it. So with the questions and the concerns being brought up, I'm just going to bring back again why I'm saying that places that bridge Norwalk instead of internally in Norwalk, I think would be better, because I'm just really trying to see with the stipulations of a no church or no schools or something, where, even though the green, like you're saying, could be, but really where truly doesn't break these rules. Because like to just say South Norwalk, I don't know where there's not a church. You know what I mean? I don't, the schooling that we would like, that we already have or we're hoping to have, there's areas indicated very close to those same spots. Again, to understand, they doesn't mean they have to be picked, but, and then you also with what Councilman Huverman said about the additional that does come with the 3 dispensaries, that again can be a burden to the residents, and in particularly, I want to say the equity part of this, the people who aren't truly able to be in the industry, and the people who will again be overly policed, for lack of better words, even though there's more legalities that are open to this, but policed under this. What would you, how do you, my question would be, how would you clarify those points in working with, because there's people who just really just don't care. They're going to advertise it. We have signage. I know on West, I think it's like on Westport Avenue that I know is already too close to a school. Like, how do we fight that?
Well, part of the good thing with this particular use versus like a liquor store or somebody else is
we have a billion liquor stores. Keep
right.
going.
This one has more state oversight and is more regulated. Like, so I understand you need a liquor license from the state, but the state doesn't regulate the signage for liquor stores. They do regulate the signage for these establishments. So I would imagine if they were, and there's strict licensing that goes along with that. So if they're in violation of a local zoning, they're also going to be in violation of the state as well. So, I mean, that's a bridge, since we don't have any establishments open yet, that hasn't been crossed, but to your point, someone's always going to push the envelope. So that's something we need to be mindful of.
Do you find that the fines are stiff enough, for example? Because there's also industries that, we're talking about the money that comes in. If it's not, we have that problem right now of ticketing organizations or finding it. That's really not, it's like $2 to them. They'll just pay it and keep going. Do you find that they, our state or federally, like our fines are helpful in making sure this doesn't happen? Because some people are just going to be like, whatever, pay it and keep doing it.
Well, I mean, if you got to that kind of scenario, which would be kind of the case with any kind of zoning violation, I guess the fine is $150 a day. So that's a cumulative fine that we can assess. And if they were just completely blatantly ignoring everything we said, we could, call Brian Kendall and say, we need to do some kind of injunction. We need to, take them to court right away and try to get this.
Okay, so those are those possibilities. That's kind of what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so in an effort not to stay up all night on this project, I thought maybe what we should do is move forward to the next section of the presentation. Josh, do you want to go to the next?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to thank Steve and Deanna. They've done a lot there, and their teams and Yella from the health department have done a lot of work on this. We have made a long set of strides in the last few months. And obviously Steve and his team are going to work on the P&Z regulations. I wanted to do a quick note because Steve brought up an important point that I don't want us to lose sight of, which is the sequencing. In order for them to do what they have to do, namely pass zoning regulations, we have to lift the moratorium, which is the big subject of this ordinance. That doesn't mean that P&Z can't be working on it in the background and getting things ready to go. But that is the sequence. There is time is of the essence here. It's something you've heard me say to you before, but now I'll also just sort of mention it publicly. Darlene, before I don't know if you had one.
Oh yeah. So you just said you have to lift the moratorium? What more?
Well, we have
the currently there is a moratorium that the council passed back in March.
Oh, you're talking about this moratorium. Okay.
Yeah,
Cannabis.
for cannabis.
You know where I was going, Steve. I was like,
yes,
what?
oh, I know where you were going.
Yeah.
Not tonight. I can't take
I
it
was
tonight.
just like, oh
no,
my
no,
God,
no.
we're not going anywhere.
No, that is no. I'm just talking about cannabis.
This
I'm
one.
not talking about
Got it.
that. All
Thank
good.
Good.
Okie dokie.
And the
Um,
moratorium goes through November, and we can talk about whether it needs to be lifted before then or not. That's open for discussion, but let's get through the ordinance right now. That's your next
Okay.
step, right, Josh?
Brian, if you wouldn't mind teeing up the ordinance on the screen. Okay, so, and if you wouldn't mind zooming in a little, Brian. Brian and I are going to sort of take turns and go through the draft ordinance itself. Very simply, again, and sort of says it at the purpose at top, we're really trying to do really three things here. One is to revoke the temporary prohibition, i.e. the moratorium, thus permitting the operation of retail cannabis. To impose limitations upon the consumption of cannabis. And three, really the establishment and the policies and procedures of the Norwalk Equity Trust. Oh, I'm sorry, the Norwalk Cannabis Trust account. Sorry, I said the wrong word. That's sort of the three main things. In the purpose section, you'll see there's a comment. We just have to sort of work out the stylistic issues. It's not a substantive issue. If you look at section 1.2, which is the definitions, some of these are highlighted because we need to sort of go back and we may need to take some out and put some in, but all the definitions themselves are
Maybe
taken
trying to make the
straight.
screen a little bit bigger. Sorry to interrupt, Josh, just so we can see. So we're just looking at the ordinance and not the comments on the side.
Right, just look at the ordinance.
Yeah, just so the comments on the side were more for your.
Yeah, that's for, yeah.
Yeah, and then maybe move the comments off to the side. We don't need to look at the comments, just looking
Yeah.
at the ordinance. It's just that way we can read it a little bit better.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, that's good.
All right. All these definitions, they are pulled directly from the state statute so that there's no discrepancy between how we as a city define these various terms and how the state defines these various terms. It's going to make enforcement a lot easier on everyone. And that way things are just very clear. There are some definitions that are in here that we need to do a little revision here, but the definitions themselves and the way they're written, not changing. If you go to section 1.3, keep scrolling.
Just quickly,
oh, sorry,
ones that
Ryan.
are highlighted in the definitional section: employee, immediate family, officer, and I believe employee at the top. Let me double check.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, employee. Those all come straight out of the definitions from Code of Ethics. So just so everyone's aware.
Ah, that's right. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. In 1.3, this is the revocation of the moratorium. The reason that, so as Lisa said, the moratorium that we passed back in March technically goes through November. In order, if we so choose, we would lift the moratorium, i.e., right now with the moratorium in place, the Planning and Zoning Department cannot accept applications for retail cannabis sites. We would be able to allow them to do that if we lift the moratorium. And then again, you can see that's A and B. They're a little redundant, but it kind of emphasizes sort of what we're doing here when it comes to the moratorium. Section C is something that's reflected that already exists in state law, but it's important to emphasize, which is that, as Steve said, if there's traffic and sort of these initial operational costs incurred by the city, the establishment is required to reimburse the city. I believe it's up to $50,000.
It's up to $50,000.
Yeah,
It's a one-time payer's fee, whatever you want to call it.
Yes. Okay. Section, I'm going to move, Brian, unless you got anything else for 1.3, I was going to move on to 1.4. Okay, seeing nothing, I'm going to move on to 1.4. This has to do with certain restrictions on public consumption. We still have a little work to do on this section. There was a point that was actually brought up to me before the meeting. And I know that I think something to look out for, obviously that it's not going to be on land controlled by the city. I want to emphasize that word because the statute actually gives the city additional powers. So it's not just land owned by the city, but also controlled by the city. That's new. That's not something that's been there before. And that's even true with something like cigarette smoke. There is a concern about making sure that it's consistent with cigarette smoke, but I think that's something that we, like how we regulate public consumption of cigarettes, but that's something we should work on. There is a notation here about taxing districts. Very simply, the city does not own land that's owned by the taxing districts. And and we have to explore and figure out, I know, Brian, we discussed this the other day, about whether the taxing districts will allow or not allow what they want to do about public consumption of cannabis on the property the taxing districts own. That's notably like the town green, Bailey Beach, et cetera. I know that's sort of an open question, and that's something we'll need to confer with the taxing districts on. That in and of itself doesn't really change the ordinance, so to speak, but it's something
that being said, just to jump in real quick, Josh, that being
Absolutely.
said, if the taxing, if the answer is that the city can control on taxing district property, then not an issue. Even if the
True,
city cannot,
yes.
the taxing district could, to be consistent with the city, could institute similar prohibitions on consumption.
Yes, thank you, Brian. That is clarifying and helpful, really helpful. I also want to note the last part of this. This is a little bit of an issue that we still have not quite resolved yet, which is that per the statute, because if we're permitting the retail sale of cannabis and one of the things that we have to do as a city under the state law, because we're a city over 50,000 people, is designate a place where there can be public consumption of cannabis. And where it says smoking, vaping, consumption of edibles, that's how it's written in the state law. There are several places still under consideration. We have not affirmatively decided on a place, and that's still very much an issue that we need to workshop. I know that there have been some conversations, but that is something I think we're going to have to come to a decision on. But I don't think there's any explicit requirements. Brian, tell me if I'm wrong. Something like it has to be a park, or it has to be a certain kind of place. In fact, the statute's actually quite vague in that it uses the word place, but doesn't actually define the term.
Correct. I was just going to, I mean, you kind of said what I was going to say, and what I was going to say about subsection C here is that it's very vague. It doesn't say how large or how small the location is, number one. And number two, in subsection B, we obviously just passed an outdoor dining ordinance, which has kind of been over, it's on the back burner because of the executive order that was just passed, extended for another year. But one of the things that's in the statute is that you cannot consume, much like you can't consume cannabis in an outdoor dining scenario. So that's going to be consistent with our code, but it's also in the statute itself, the state statute as well.
I thought I saw some hands raised. Does anyone have
I was
any
going to say,
questions
Jeff,
right
do you
now?
want to take questions as we go, or would you rather them at the end?
If people can hold them to the end, I think that would be better. But if someone has like a question that has to be answered right this second.
Okay, so let's keep going. Thank you.
Brian, I'm going to kick it over to you on 1.5.
I could take myself off mute here. So similar to what we've said earlier, this section is kind of a work in progress. The general statute, the statute that was just passed, allows for a fine or a citation of $50 for a person who violates consuming cannabis outside in an area that's not designated by the municipality. There's a $1,000 fine for a business that violates this chapter. So when we're dealing with a citation, we have to discuss due process. And so one of the issues that we have to resolve is how, if somebody is given a citation, how are we going to ensure, number one, that they would pay it? How does the city enforce it to be paid? And how would somebody have the right to appeal it, i.e. due process rights? So that's kind of a work in progress, which is why you see it highlighted in yellow here. There's at least a couple of things that's kind of bouncing around right now. The first one is there's Connecticut General Statutes 7-152C, which actually deals with 7-148, which is the scope of municipal powers, which is what this amendment that we're discussing right now is for the cannabis statute was placed in 7-148. So 7-152C is a way to allow somebody to go through an appeal process. However, there are other ways to do it. One way that we were thinking about, and again, nothing is set in stone here, is somebody is walking down the street and they're consuming cannabis in an area that they're not supposed to. Officer walks up and provides them with a ticket or a citation. They then have the right, similar to a speeding ticket, to write, I'm not guilty and I'm sending it back in. And in that situation, then a court date would be set up. I'm assuming at the GA in Norwalk, but we don't know. But so that would satisfy, number one, the collection issue. And number two, it would satisfy the due process issue, because that person would have the right to go to a court and argue that they weren't violating the ordinance and the state statute. Now, again, this is not set in stone, but one of the other things is, first we have to reach out to the GA in Norwalk and speak to their prosecutors to find out what it is that they're doing in response to this new law, number one. And number two, if we decide to proceed down the second option, which is they go to the GA after checking off not guilty on the citation, if the GA is doing it, then I believe that the $50 or $1,000 fine, if it was enforced, would go to the state and not to the city. So these are things that we have to consider. There might be other options that we have to consider as well, but these were the two that popped out. And so I felt, and one of them just came up today, which is why it's not in here. But this is why we have it listed in here and highlighted in yellow, because this is not in any way, shape, or form in final form.
I would also add, and I know this is, I'm tipping my hat to my friend Tom Keegan here. This is the design here, and I think we can go back if we need to strengthen it. It is to give a certain amount of discretion, for the enforcement, because of course there are a whole number of facts and fact patterns. I think this language is designed to do that, but I think that's just something to keep in mind for both the due process standpoint, but also the enforcement standpoint.
So the only other thing I would mention is that you can see that in 1.5A and 1.5B, one of them has a written warning and one doesn't. This is something that, and by the way, the fines in the statute say may, it doesn't say shall. So this doesn't mean that, I'm just letting you know that this is not mandatory. This is something that says may, so you have discretion as to whether you want to do this. But the other thing is, and this is a decision for everyone on the Ordinance Committee, is do you want a written warning or not for the $50 fine or the $1,000 fine? But I just wanted to point that out. And there's a difference here, but that's not to say that there's any kind of decision made. This is just so you know that there's a choice between a written warning and then a fine, or just a fine.
Yes, and this is something that we went through with Mr. Keegan from his perspective as a police officer. We had a different view for people and a different view for businesses, because the idea with businesses is that they might have somebody, if they're a restaurant, who is in violation, they might be trying to deal with it in an appropriate way. So we want to give some discretion in that situation too.
Yeah, and also I want to emphasize, and Brian made this point, we're not requiring law enforcement to find someone. There is discretion. That is not a binary requirement. And I just wanted to make that clear.
And again, sorry to jump in on with Josh, but again, just in terms of the 7-152C, it's it is a cumbersome process. Notices have to go out. If the person decides to appeal, then it's similar to what we do with blight or zoning, where somebody has the right to appeal, then the law department would advocate on behalf of the officer or department that is pursuing the citation in front of a neutral attorney, or, usually it's an attorney, but somebody who's volunteering their time to make a decision, i.e. in zoning or blight, and then they would make that decision. And the reason why we do 7-152C with blight and with zoning is that we can just attach a judgment lien on a person's property if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Whereas here, we would then have to file some kind of filing with the court. And if we're pursuing a $50 fine, I believe that the filing fee in this type of instance is $8. So all of a sudden it's not $50 anymore. Now it's $42. And then the law department would continue on and trying to enforce what could amount to a $42 fine. So that's another.
To let us know is that this is a work in progress.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I think if it's all right, Brian. Yeah. All right. So the last big part of this is, and I'm looking at, we're calling it the Norwalk Cannabis Trust Account. I do see that it's, I believe it's referred another way throughout the ordinance in some respects, but for now we're calling it the Norwalk Cannabis Trust. What this is very similar to what we've been discussing with Lisa and Greg Burnett when it comes to affordable housing. Very simply, this is what's called a non-lapsing trust account, which means it's a separate account in the city. And so that for all of this, the 3% municipal sales tax revenue is all going to come into one place. And that trust, the purpose, the permitted purposes in which funds can be spent in that trust are listed in Section A. And again, and just to emphasize, that is, those purposes are exactly what is listed in the state statute. I have not, we have not, altered the terms or anything like that. We are, to the extent, this is the classic situation where there are strings attached. And so these are the strings. You can see that, and again, just so everyone sees, the purposes are streetscape improvements and other neighborhood developments in communities where cannabis retailers, hybrid retailers, and micro-cultivators are located. We've had some debate about this. Our interpretation of this is that, say, a place like this is in South Norwalk, therefore we can use money for streetscape improvements and other neighborhood developments in South Norwalk. If there's one in East Norwalk, same situation. Though I don't believe the statute explicitly defines the term communities. That's, I believe, the way we've sort of safely tried to interpret this. The remaining purposes, everything from, as you can see, education programs and youth employment, services for individuals who were released from the Department of Corrections, mental and health addiction services, youth service bureaus, community civic engagement efforts. Those are not tied to a location. Those are for efforts that can happen anywhere in the city, and it doesn't matter where either the retail or a micro-cultivator facility are.
And just to jump in real quick, Josh, in terms of the money, the statute makes clear that the money that is obtained from the retail establishments selling these things through the sales tax is to be used for these items that Josh just went through. And so the point of this trust account is so that there's transparency, so that when it goes into the general fund, it goes through the general fund and then goes to this trust account, so that everyone knows that it's not going into the general fund and then it's just being lost in the other spending. It's being kept in this specific location so that we can honor what the statute is telling us to do, which is to use this money for these specific things.
Exactly.
Brian took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I wanted to say. I mean, this is an effort about being transparent and showing, people that the money is being spent in strict adherence to these principles, and hopefully in a way that can, really benefit the city.
Darlene has a question. Darlene, is that question pertinent to this that you'd like?
Yep, to this piece right here. So, the list of things look really beneficial to the community. but I think I've said this before. And I think when I think of what this whole cannabis thing is supposed to be addressing is the disparity that communities suffered when
Right.
cannabis was illegal. And
Yeah.
so if we are really talking about addressing those concerns in an intentional and meaningful way, we have to talk about those things that have held the community at bay, and it's education. And we all know that. And so if we're talking about building equity and making a change in the way things were done and the things that people suffered from lack of for so many years, decades even, education is a key component to changing the lives of families. And if we're talking about building a new school in the community of people we've talked about who have been disenfranchised and from communities that have been disinvested and divested in, such as South Norwalk, here's an opportunity to make a real change and a real contribution financially to making sure that Black and brown children that are going to be primarily in this school benefit for generations to come. All these things here listed are great, and I'm not speaking against them. But the fact that I don't see anything about education, and we as a city can control that. I'm not saying money needs to go elsewhere, but I think that should be added, if it can. If you're saying to me that this is what the state of Connecticut or the federal government has allowed, I see education programs. I'm talking about educating young babies from K to 5th grade on.
Yeah, so I just want to take this and answer what Darlene's saying with all the sincerity it deserves, which is that the reason a lot of us are very intrigued and why this has gotten a lot of attention and deserving attention is because this does pose a tremendous opportunity for the city to get another and potentially lucrative revenue stream to do this very thing and to try and improve the lives, particularly for communities that were adversely affected by the war on drugs. That's the reason why we're here. That's the reason why this is something that's required a lot of attention. Now, Darlene, in terms of the ordinance itself, the reason that we included the specific statutory language in there was to make it very clear for accountability and for accountability to the public, but also for the states to make it very clear exactly that we're overlaying it with how the state has sort of deemed the permissive uses for funds from this revenue stream. That's not to say that we're not handicapping ourselves to something. It's more that we're trying to show that this is where this revenue stream is going to go, and that it's not going to just, as Brian said, go in the general funds and then just get sort of lost into the wind.
But Josh, let me just clarify one of the points that you made. I thought, as my understanding was, that the state requires that we only give it to these 7 projects. That this is
right. Yes, this is why.
So yeah, we can't add in some extra things. We can't take things out. This is what the state says. You can spend this money on these 7 things.
So Lisa, in answer to your question, this is section 126 of the Public Act that passed this. And as you can see, it says the tax collected pursuant to this section, and say shall be used by such municipality. And then it lists obviously the ones that that Josh just read. So as you can see, it has A, B, C, D, E, and F. And it has all those. Again, I think that if you're asking me to read these, I think that they're not, I think that they're vague. I think that they're intentionally vague to allow some discretion as to how it's to be used, but they specifically list those. There could be an amendment that allows more, but when this says shall be used, that it means that those are the ones for now that can be used.
And I agree. And it's separate and apart from the statutory text. Every communication we've had, that we've received or is publicly available from the state on, has made it very clear that these are the permitted uses and that there aren't additional permitted uses. Now, Darlene, that doesn't mean, especially because it literally says education programs in the, in the
municipality.
language. Yeah, it doesn't mean we can't use it for those purposes at all.
Can I just jump in and ask? I have a lot of different questions, particularly
Wait,
because we're talking about
Diana,
education.
before you go forward, please, I just want to make sure that
sorry.
Diana's question, yeah, we need to
Oh,
finish.
sorry, Darlene.
Yeah, if Darlene wants to finish her comments or questions, this would be the time.
No, and I thought Josh was saying something.
No, what I'm saying is, very simply, I don't think we actually are disagreeing with anything here. I think that, and I know that this is something that we discuss and we should continue to discuss as we go through this process. But these are the stated purposes. I think that when Lamont, does his presentation of sort of, as we talk about sort of the guidelines and how we're going to consider all the, the variables that comes up when it comes to how the city is going to spend the money or how we may allow, nonprofits or other people to apply for, or for funds, that is where a lot of those questions are going to come up. Insofar as the creation, this particular section is just creating the trust instrument and stating the permitted purposes for how the trust can be spent in accordance with the state law, which is why it references the state law in the very first part of the paragraph.
So Darlene, does that answer, maybe not satisfactory, but does that answer your question for?
Yeah, so in essence, any other municipality language would be similar to this. They could choose all of these items or whatever ones, but this is the language.
The lay of the land. Yeah.
This is the state statute. The state has said for these funds, it has to be spent on any of these 7 or 6 purposes. And those are the proverbial strings attached. As Brian said, they're vague. So it gives the municipality room for creativity, but there are strings attached.
So Darlene, if you're okay, then I'll turn to Ms. Revolus, unless I want to make sure that you're covered.
Thank you.
Already good.
Oh, I'm not good, but thank you.
Yeah, no. I want to make sure that you have completed your.
But thank you.
Yeah. Ms.
Yeah,
Revolus, now it's your turn.
I appreciate it because I was even going to hold my questions later and add to what Councilwoman Young is saying in my questioning about education. I do have a lot of questions, but I'm adding to what she's saying, in particularly with an educational program and to a community who has been, when I said equity and inclusion, do these programs educate the community that was disenfranchised for this, how to actually profit and become a part of this industry? It's not just educating like, oh, your kids to keep away, but how do I put economic growth to the same community who was stipulated by this? Do you educate that community on how to become owners, how to get grants for this, how to be a major part of this industry, not just employed by you guys and watch you guys benefit from it, but should be the leading front of people who were entrepreneurship that went to jail for it, that should be first in line to be able to run this. So when I hear education, I think we think one way, but is there an educational program in developing people to be in this industry, profitable from this industry, and sustainable generationally? That's where my question was, because everything else I'll hold to the end. Ask that, but I'm talking about education. Are we educating people on how to become beneficial and profitable from this industry? Because either way, this is being dominated by one class where another class was heavily disenfranchised. And this is what I keep talking about. We're going to be overly policed. People are going to run in and out, and there's a community who's going to benefit and a community that's going to not. We're still at the not. So is the educational part of getting people to understand this industry and be in the lucrative process to be front runners here? Because I don't want to just be employed by you. I want to own the dispensary. I want to own the place that's growing the marijuana. You're not putting us in those lanes. So that's what I also want to know with educational situations. That's why I wanted to jump back on Darlene. I have completely different questions, but this is a big part. And that educational and training and whatever, don't just make us employees. How are we becoming developers? How are we becoming owners? How are we becoming a place and space where our children's children can work in this?
So I just, you can see there, one of the permissive where it says education programs or youth employment and training programs. I would imagine that programs about, if an application comes through and we think it's something we'd like to fund that has to do with training in this industry, I think that's something that, and I think that, when Lamont sort of talks about the guidelines, I think that's something that is worthy of discussion and consideration. But I also think it's a little bit putting the cart before the horse,
no,
Diana.
sir.
And well, no, hold on a minute. And I know you and I have spoken about this, and I am all game. And I know you've talked about hemp, and I think it's a really good conversation to have. But for the purposes of what we're trying to do here, in terms of setting up the mechanism and getting this going, that's not quite what we're trying to achieve in terms of just getting the ordinance and getting the mechanism up and running.
Yeah, unfortunately,
I'm not saying what you're saying isn't important. It is important. But I'm just saying, I just don't want us to get far afield from what the thing is here.
Yeah,
I hear you, but I just
so
don't
Diana
think
and
that
Josh,
that's
I'd like to
far
make one point as the
off.
chair. I take the floor for one moment as the chair,
Yes, of
because we do
course.
need to keep our focus on what it is we can do within this committee and what we are here to do tonight. And there is a lot of debate about what the appropriate things to do are and how to properly support the community that was most adversely impacted by that.
So,
and we could talk about that, and it's
Lisa-
important, but it's
Lisa-
beyond what we're doing now. I'm sorry.
Lisa, can I just add one thing very quickly? So hopefully this gives at least some of a response to Diana. So part of this law, if I understand it correctly, involves social equity applications,
Yes.
and that goes through the state. Norwalk has no control over who applies for these retail establishments or things of that nature and who actually gets them. But the law in Connecticut, as I understand it when I read it some time ago, was that the state was going to be giving, I don't know the word, I'm trying to find the word, but I'm not going to get it, is giving some kind of, whatever it might be, it's giving it to people that have been negatively impacted
Some kind
in
of
the past.
They're
Thank
called
you.
social equity applicants.
Yes.
That's what the
So
state
social
is calling
equity
them.
applicants. So again, it's the state that controls that aspect of it. We don't,
Yeah.
in Norwalk, don't have any control over that, but I'm hoping that at least gives some of a response to you.
So then
Yeah.
if in the questions that because that does, and it does, I just wanted to bring that up on tagging what Councilwoman Young was saying. I get you, Josh, but I really don't think it's almost like how we don't do prevention, we do reactions. That should be first and foremost. It really should be. But in my questions of what you guys just brought up, we're still waiting to do community conversations before even thinking about lifting moratoriums is my first question, right? How does private property affect somebody who's smoking outside? What places are we thinking about directly that could be the space and place to be of a public venue to be able to smoke in? How do people of medical marijuana or vaping look with violations? And I'm still kind of weirded by the business versus people aspect. So these are direct questions I had beforehand. It just that came up. I just wanted to bring that up with education because that's a part I think is missed. But this is my questions that I was going to ask towards what you said.
And Diana, just to, this is Brian again, just to hopefully put a bow on what I said earlier. There's a main stage that will occur for qualified social equity applicants.
Yes,
and
sir.
there's a lottery to determine which applicants will receive the limited number of licenses that are currently available. So again, that's through the state, and I'll let anybody who can answer that last question that Diana had certainly go ahead.
Yeah, it was a few. Thank you, Brian.
Well, I mean, Diana, I think they're super important questions, but some of them are beyond the scope of this committee, and really the scope of all of us. I think it's for us to, bring that conversation to the community and to the broader government.
No, the questions that I have though were directly from what was being said. I get with the education part, I get that. But again, we're still waiting for a community conversation before lifting the moratorium, right? How do we?
It goes through November.
Right, okay. So that's one. How is private property affected if for outside spaces? For example, like you were talking about, people can't just be smoking anywhere. So what if how does, privately owned spaces, like I'm outside on my yard work? What are the places that we may have been thinking of? Like maybe it's Vets Park or maybe it's Cranberry Park, but what are the listing of places you were thinking about? How was somebody in violations? What if they have medical marijuana? Because, a lot of people walk around with those vape pens, like Councilwoman Air was saying, that is marijuana, and they're in a restaurant using it. So how does that work with violations with someone with medical marijuana or vape? And then again, when you guys were talking about violation versus business versus people, this is right within the confines of what you guys were talking about, that I'm just asking clarification.
To answer one of your questions, Diana, and this probably isn't much of an answer, but when you're talking about somebody who's smoking on private property, this ordinance only deals with property that is owned or controlled by the city. Now, that being said,
there's no, okay, I get you.
Right. So, but that being said, this, I mean, if you were to ask me, I would say that it would be on a case by case basis, quite honestly. If somebody is sitting out in their front yard on private property and they're smoking, and the smoke is going onto a city sidewalk, query as to, they're on private property, but the smoke is traveling, as opposed to somebody who's eating an edible on their private property. There's not going to be any kind of transmission of smoke going on to what could be city owned or controlled property. So again, it's hopefully to answer that question, case by case basis.
Gotcha.
As to the other ones about specifically what was being considered in terms of locations, I would defer to other people.
Yeah, I mean, very simply, Diana, on the locations, I know there have been discussions of a few parks, but again, we're also looking for a little more consultation, because it doesn't require that it be a park. It just says the word place. So the answer is, stay tuned. We don't have an answer to that one yet.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect.
But some of the other questions, if you don't mind, and if you don't mind, Diana, we can take it offline. They're not quite related, and Lamont still has to sort of do his explanation. So if you don't mind, I'd like to sort of move it along.
No worries to that.
I saw Dominique's got her hand up though.
Dominique, you had a question. If your question is pertinent to this, or if you want to wait, whatever you'd prefer.
No, I'll wait, because I believe since Lamont has yet to speak, I want to hear the whole question. Yeah, thank you.
Just to summarize.
Continue on, Josh.
And just to finish it out and summarize the rest of the ordinance. The rest of it has to do with sort of administration and reporting of the trust. Very simply, the way this works in very brief terms, the state, it's a municipal sales tax. And of course, municipalities don't normally get sales tax. So the way this is going to end up working is the state's Department of Revenue Services is going to get in touch with, and we've listed the chief financial officer. They're going to provide sort of quarterly invoices of basically what the various cannabis establishments owe in terms of municipal sales tax. Then the city will actually invoice those businesses and receive the funds. And then those funds, of course, will go into this trust account. The other thing I should note is that this is a non-lapsing trust, again, that it will be perpetual, notwithstanding, just like the Affordable House Trust, a housing trust that's under consideration right now. Again, most of the rest of that is just sort of encapsulated in what I said. I also, section 1.8, and I see that Lamont has turned his screen on at the precisely correct moment, because this is the chief of community services, or his or her, their designee, shall prepare, adopt, or publish on the city's website the Norwalk Cannabis Trust account expenditure guidelines. I also see, by the way, the headline of 1.8 is incorrect. It should say cannabis, not equity trust account.
Josh, can you just touch on the, also on the ethical, that we, the
yeah, so one other thing I would note before Lamont does about the guidelines, and you can see, and it's highlighted under section F, but it says, as of now.
Bring it back up.
Yeah, I think while Brian's bringing it back up,
Okay.
just very briefly, that no officer or employee of the city or any member of his or her or their immediate family may receive a financial benefit, as such terms are defined already in the Norwalk Code, from or have any direct or indirect interest in any person, which includes person under the statute, includes businesses that receives funds from this trust account, i.e. city officials, elected officials can't get money from this. And then the last thing, and Lamont will go over this too, but that there will be a report that gets published annually of how much the trust collected, expenditures, where the money went, et cetera. But I'm gonna now turn it over to Lamont Daniels, who's gonna talk a little bit about the guidelines and concept here.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I think you all mentioned I probably wouldn't need a PowerPoint, but those of you that know me from the Community Services Committee, I like PowerPoints. It helps to keeps me focused too. So let me share my screen. Can you all see that? So to Josh's point, what I would like to do is just really share with you concepts, because we're still talking about it. And I would imagine there may be some reiterations over time. And I'm hoping that I can address a little bit of what I heard in the conversation based on the charge that the ordinance has directed my department to create procedures, rules, guidelines, and so forth. So we've all heard this, so won't belabor this, but the exciting thing is, and that's the way at least I see it, is that for the first time, as Councilman Josh mentioned, that this 3% municipal sales tax will be given to municipalities. And I think we're all waiting to see what that looks like over time. As Councilman mentioned, there's projections out there, but I take the position we won't really know till it really happens, right?
Exactly.
But so let me just move me out the way. For those of you that done PowerPoints, you have to minimize you too. So the Community Service Department is uniquely positioned to administer, taking language directly from the draft ordinance, the established Cannabis Trust Fund. The way we see it, and kind of elevating some of the points, and then in our review of the state statute as well, that there certainly is language that this is a tool to improve the outcomes of our vulnerable populations and then our communities at large, but specifically articulated within those prioritized categories that we were all just talking about previously. But also there is some language around directing funding to address the inequities and deficiencies in the delivery system and even access to health and other human services. And I think Brian indicated the Social Equity Fund. And I think that is definitely something from a local perspective we can look at and design a strategy both from a local perspective. So things that are in development as directed from the ordinance is that my office will offer procedures, guidelines, rules, and requirements. And it's my understanding, Councilman Josh, that this would be approved through Common Council, or at least reviewed, at least vetted through you all once we put forth this draft proposal. And it has already been articulated that under Public Act 21-1, they clearly articulate these 6 areas for the purpose of where we're focusing on in our department. And we haven't talked about this prior, is that the education programs, the services for individuals who are released from Department of Custody, for example, custody, probation, and parole, mental health and addiction services. And I'm not going to read, and we were just talking about them. And I know that streetscape improvements kind of this outlier. And I know I've had some, brief conversation with the mayor's office to maybe bring in my colleague Jessica to look at what that criteria look like, because that's not my expertise, but work in concert and complement each other. But here's a slide that I wanted to lift up because as it was talked about that the social equity department or office, if you will, has identified in our state what they call disproportionately impacted areas. And they actually give it language looking at the census tracts in our state that either has a historical conviction rate for drug-related offenses greater than 110. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I can make this slide deck available. But the Social Equity Council approved this last year. There's actually about 215 DIAs, as they are commonly referred to, and Norwalk is no stranger. We have some. And so these census tracts, they use data sets around arrest and conviction records from the Department of Emergency Services and the Public Protection and so forth. And actually did a quick snapshot that in Norwalk, this highlighted area, I couldn't overlay it, and maybe talking with Stephen, we can probably overlay it and really get those specific neighborhoods but this is just a snapshot that are based on the disproportionately impacted areas. This map articulates that, so that is most definitely an area that as we think about at least the categories that have been defined, that we can then broadly think about what we can do within those categories to ensure that we are looking at this opportunity or this funding stream to really look at the inequities partnering with our nonprofit organizations. So what I just laid out that's here for you is really common basic eligibility. So looking at the Council of Nonprofits, and there's a whole list of best practices that funding organizations, whether it's trust fund allocations, grant funding, private-public partnerships that they use. And these are areas that I will be proposing that all organizations should be a tax-exempt charitable organization in good standing as described as this section IRS Code 501c3. And that whatever we fund through the trust fund, that the sole benefit will be for Norwalk residents. For those that have heard me speak, Norwalk has a great wealth of nonprofit organizations, but we also have a few that are regional. So even if regional programs are being offered in our city, we want to make sure that specific funding stream is directed to Norwalk residents. I think it's important that whatever funding the city allocates or whatever funding stream it comes, that we want to look at the fiscal ability or capacity that the organization has to disperse and administer funds. And a common practice is looking at 990s, and there's the easy ones for smaller organizations and the most comprehensive ones for the larger organizations. And that because this money will be distributed from the city, that there will be a contract involved, which allows for accountability and transparency, that whatever organizations have come forth that, excuse me, have identified to use the funding, that there is a contract that, that we would expect them to fulfill with the funding that they receive. And this is a line item that we use for ARPA funding. But again, this is up for discussion because I think through Common Council, you all will be looking at our proposal and kind of, direct my department, what you may ask us to reconsider or talk about it more. But this really addresses the sustainability piece, which I've been a big advocate around, that, funding organizations or funding programs, we want to make sure that beyond this funding allocation, that the funding, that the program can sustain itself. What I know as a nonprofit manager, that funding programs for 1 year and then the lack of funding, that program just dissolves. But more importantly, the people that were engaged in those programs are now lost or have nowhere to go. So that's something that, we'll be proposing. I actually have a draft kind of 10-page already, but it's in draft, so I didn't want to share it tonight, but just want to give you an idea of where our department is thinking. And then also, there are common program requirements. These are widely accepted practices and grant requirements and grant receivings that, we'll be looking for organizations to address one of those prioritized categories. The target populations, for example, the DLC, that's a target population. So we want to make sure that people are able to articulate that, describe the goals. What do you want to do? How are you going to make a difference? What are the equity issues that you want to address? And as I pointed out earlier, demonstrating the ability to manage and distribute the funds in the way that you have articulated. I think partnership is really critical, important. That's the way the funding practices are moving, that, organizations both from the private and public sector are no longer funding, individuals or individual organizations, but really encouraging partnership and collaboration, because it's just the best way to do business, but also the best way to wrap around a variety of services so we can help all Norwalkers, and no one organization can do it alone. The other piece is, and I think it really looks at equity that I want to call out, is that as we think about this trust fund, that we want to make sure that the services are available and convenient, accessible in locations. And here's the point I want to emphasize, that suitable for the target population. So if you're thinking about running programs in a community, but they have to travel on bus and cab and taxi and Uber, that's something we want to look at, because we want to remove all barriers. And I think that gets at the equity. And then number 6, which is so important, Norwalk is a very diverse community. We want to embrace programs that are culturally responsive, that understand the needs with, including bilingual capacity and addressing cultural relevant services. And then the other piece, as I pointed out earlier, is really looking at, the ability to demonstrate impact and measurable outcomes to improve quality of life. And I think we owe that to our residents, that not just be engaged in a program, but we want to make sure that program is impactful. I think it was discussed during the discussion I haven't heard, that we're really changing lives. I think that's how, at least our department is looking at the trust fund, is, looking at programs that can really change the lives. They may start at point A, but through your program or through your project, how can you move them to point B? How can you move them to sustainability? How can you move them to empowerment? How can you move them to change their lives? But there's a lot of work that is still kind of taking place, in our draft form. Looking at equity, not just from a program perspective, but from the organizations that may say, hey, we believe we can address some of those issues. So we want to look at the actual application itself. So we're looking at best practices around simplified grant application models. We all know, for those that have been in a nonprofit business, some of these applications are monumental, but we don't have to create this monumental application. We want to be fair, we want to be equitable, but we also want to be transparent, and we want the organization to articulate to the best of their ability what they plan to do. What we need to address is funding ranges. I know Councilman Josh has mentioned that there's a lot of projections on the funding, but here's the point that I want to make, that funding ranges will be dependent upon the tax revenue that is collected and received, and we will then determine what that looks like. The other point that we're focusing on is the grant administration, whether it's a rolling grant process, but I would then say, but that requires administrative support from our department. And basically what a rolling grant process is, as the money comes in, we will solicit grant opportunities. That is a model, but again, we'll have to look at the capacity and resources for our department in order to manage such a rolling process. Then there's a fix. It can be done annually or biannually, but that's something we'll have to look at over time. But I just wanted to point that out, that these are areas that we are looking at presently. And looking at the programs, do we want to focus on just new programs, innovative program, or a program that can be expanded, or a combination of all three? But these are just areas that we're looking at. And then review of the disproportionately impacted areas. There are best practices that we will be proposing that, targeting some of the funding specifically to those areas. The state has already identified what those areas in Norwalk. So that's something that we can look at, and I would say that we should look at as a community. Implementation of an online platform, that is a cost, but we definitely want to use technology as a way to help people, but not as a barrier in terms of how organizations apply. And then the promotion and publicizing the access to the fund, we're developing strategies to do that. And then the big piece is forming the selection of the award of guidelines and criteria. What will be that criteria to say, we believe this is an application that we would submit to Common Council for approval, and Common Council then will vote on whether that application meets the criteria and sufficient enough to then fund to make a difference in our community. And then the last piece that articulated in the ordinance is that, as I kind of alluded to, what is that process and procedural process that we presented to, indicated in the language around presenting to the Community Services Common Council Committee first, and then the Common Council. So that's what I have for you today. That's what my team and I, let me unshare. That's what my team and I have been thinking. As I pointed out, we actually do have a draft kind of application and rules and regulations that we kind of put forth today, and I'll be tweaking and looking at a little bit more, but then be looking forward to engage this body or the committee at the committee level of what that draft will look like. So I'll defer back to you, Councilman Josh.
Oh, I just want to say, first of all, as chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. Councilman Lisa Shannon is the chair.
No, I just wanted to say
apologize.
thank you so much, because that was a very thorough presentation, and there's just so much to be absorbed there. And it's a little early for us to really get into the weeds of the debt. I don't mean to use the word weeds.
I was the first one tonight. I didn't do it.
The first one to fall into that hole. It was me. All right, next time everybody pays a nickel every time they say that. Or they have to buy the round of drinks. So anyway, I think that getting into the very detailed details at this time is probably a little mature. It's 9:30 at night. So Josh, are there a few things that you'd like to pull out from Lamont's presentation? And then we'll take a couple of questions, but I know that people have, we've been here a long time.
Yeah, I mean, look, very, very briefly. Lamont, first of all, did a phenomenal job. Councilman Josh is my new name, and I'm wearing it proudly. I do want to mention, though, the way the ordinance is structured. The guidelines do not need to be complete in order for the ordinance to be passed. The ordinance is actually mandating that the guidelines be created, not that the guidelines need to be created before the ordinance is passed. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands the timing and the sequencing. So Lamont and his team are going to work on it, but it doesn't need to be finished before we pass the ordinance. Otherwise, I think we've basically hit all the major points. Obviously, there are things we need to work on, but we're getting pretty close to the finish line here in terms of the conceptual thing. And I also, before questions, I just, again, want to thank everyone here. Lisa, Tom Livingston, Tom Keegan, or I've been referring to the Toms, Brian, and Darlene, Diana, I mean, everyone who has contributed and talked about this and shown interest in this. I am enormously grateful for your support and help. And obviously, as you've seen, it's been a lot of work. So we're more to come, but I'm very appreciative and grateful and helping me, lead this effort. But with that, they're like 4 million questions.
Before I go to questions, I want to thank you, you, Josh, and the two Toms for all of the hard work that we've done on this very first rough draft. And also, I know that several times it's come up that we have to have community outreach, and the city does. I don't know that it's exactly the job totally of this committee to do all of the community outreach. I know that the mayor's office and some other community groups are also very concerned about outreach. So I think that outreach is going to come in a variety of forms, not just from this committee. What this committee is very, very conscious of is to have this fulsome conversation tonight. Make sure that it's on YouTube for people to reach. Obviously, when we go to public hearing on this ordinance, there'll be another chance for people to make comment. People didn't come to comment today, but we're going to go through a couple more drafts, so the community will have chances to look at this ordinance several times, and that is the job of this committee. So I just want to make sure that people understand that not all of the heavy lifting is going to come out of this committee for purposes of community outreach. Nicole, I think your hand was up first, then Dominique, Nora, and then Darlene.
So two things. The first thing, Chief Daniels, is it possible, no, let me do this first. To the committee, is it possible, and I don't have the language in front of me, does it allow for any of the money to be used for the administration of the money? Don't have to answer that, but see if you can find that answer, please. So is there any way that the money that is coming in, a part of that can be used for the administration of the money? That's question one. And question two is there any, and you might not have this answer, do we have to immediately dispense of the money once it comes in? I think earlier in the presentation, somebody said the end of this month, end of this year, the beginning of next year. Is it a possibility that we can wait a year, delay the disbursement of the money a year so that we have a larger pot of money so that we can have a bigger impact? That's my two questions, and thank you for my time.
Josh, don't you think that we've thought that the pot's going to be the way it is, and there'll be a process that might go through maybe Community Services Committee or some other committee where these things have to get passed? So I don't think it's like in and out type of process.
No, I don't think so either. And I think that, again, we are not required by law to put this in a trust account. This is something that we're affirmatively deciding to do. And I don't believe
that's not my question.
No,
Don't go down that rabbit hole.
I got you. Don't worry. I got you. The question is, I do not believe in my reading of the state law, but I'm happy to go back and check that the state law requires that the money be spent within a certain period of time. All it does is talk about the permitted uses of the funds. I don't believe it provides a temporal restriction on when the funds must be spent by. I think it's a great question. And I think something we're going to need to consider is how long to wait before, because, on day one of retail sales, we're not going to have funds that people can apply for. It's going to take a little while, at least a quarter for there to be money. And as I said, based on the state's fiscal office's projections, there isn't going to be a lot of money right at first. It's going to take a little while to develop.
That's why not to cut you off, Josh, but for someone who runs programming and who runs a nonprofit, it is more beneficial for the work that has been outlined to do if you have a pool of money that's at a certain amount. It's more beneficial. Please trust me on this. This is my bread and butter.
I am trusting you on that.
It's more beneficial to wait till that pool of money gets to a certain level than the in and out in which you spoke of. But we could talk offline. Lamont,
yeah, I hear you.
Me or whomever, those two questions answer before we continue the discussion. Thank you.
Great questions, Nicole. Thank you. I think that I saw Dominique's hand up next. Yep, there you go.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Chair Daniels and Councilmember Goldstein. This is really great information. I think for me, I'm going to reread the state statute before we have our public hearing, just because I got to brush up. Some of the things I'm going to say, because I've been taking notes as the presentations went on, may be answered in that, but I just want to kind of just put them out on the floor. First of all, I'm feeling that a lot of where I'm at right now is about not just enforcement, but public education about this. And I know we've talked about this leading up to this moment. So, and I think a lot of the equity piece may also be there, right? So, for example, like I'm just thinking of small business owners in the restaurants, like if they have somebody who is, after a written warning, if that's what we decide to do, refuses to not consume cannabis at the restaurant, then is it up to the restaurant to, for lack of a better word, kick out the patron who refuses to stop imbibing? I don't know if that's like a Norwalk PD conversation we want to kind of loop them in with or not, but that just came to my mind.
No, it actually is. And that's something we've actually begun discussing with the chief, and actually we've had meetings with the chief to that effect. And one thing we asked the chief to do, and he's begun to do this, is reach out to police chiefs, particularly in Massachusetts, where this has been legal for quite a while, to get best practices. So this is something that is well within the wheelhouse and something that we're beginning to figure out. Though it won't show up in an ordinance, that is an enforcement issue that is top of mind.
Right.
And plus, our Tom Keegan has played an instrumental role.
Oh, I bet he has. No, that's good.
So
yes, that's good. Yes.
There we go.
And then just thank you, Tom. That's awesome. I know it. And like, let's kind of off that piece. so the public is informed about this. I know we're going to probably have an education campaign about, very clearly, this is what happens if you refuse to leave an establishment. And then the other pieces I'm seeing, we have the billboard on 95 by the mall that the state obviously put up, but education around like how much you can carry and where, and that I think is going to be a big thing about equity too in that regard, because we know the disproportionate enforcement up to this point in our history for Black and brown men in particularly. But then the other piece is storing cannabis, like not just like you may be unknowingly in violation of the law, even in your own home by the amount you have, but then also, do you have children? Do you have pets? How are we going to make sure people know how to safely store this so everyone in that home is safe? And so those are they're obviously not questions, but just things that have come up in my mind as we've talked about this. So thank you. I'll yield the rest of my time since we are 9:39.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And those are things that sounds like the Department of Health will have a full slate of conversations about and concerning. Nora.
I just had one quick question that I think was implicit in what Lamont said, but these guidelines can be, I assume, revised as priorities shift, as, for instance, we might need to make a greater investment in public health messaging in the first instance. But then, to Darlene's point, perhaps we feel like long-term more usage is, it's more important that we're funding programs in the education space. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that's my understanding. I've also been on the phone with my similar colleagues all across the state. So similar to the ARPA, these are the categories, and I think Brian can also speak to this. We don't have to say we're going to do all 6 or 7, but these are these are the categories. So as we think about the prioritization and the need, we most certainly can direct within these guidelines the best way to make impact and make a difference in our communities.
And one thing, Nora, that we took up in the statute, or the ordinance, I should say, is under expenditures. There is a section where we say, these guidelines have to come in front of the Common Council from time to time, so that we expect that the guidelines, we're all learning. So we're going to probably rewrite these guidelines a few times. So,
and the other thing, Nora, is and exactly what Lisa and Lamond have said, which is that we do want flexibility. We're taking a very similar tack to what we did in outdoor dining to afford us that level of flexibility, so that we can make changes. And as priorities shift, as these public education shifts, as frankly as we as a state learn more about how this is or isn't working. There is a little bit of a Brave New World element to a lot of this. And so we are trying to proceed, cautiously and expeditiously, because there is a temporal element to this too.
Great, thank you. I saw that in the ordinance, and I just felt like that was an important thing that should come into this discussion, because I think it is helpful for the public to understand where, sort of the flexibility you're building in here. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for making that point, because we probably should have. David, what would you like to say?
Thank you, Chair. Lamont, has the state put out very specific guidelines as to the reporting on how the money is being spent? Similar to, I know, we're talking about the ARPA funds, and we have very specific guidelines with the Fed on how the money is being spent. Are they doing the same with this money that any municipality that is, selling cannabis is going to get? Are we going to have the same sort of reporting? First question. Second question is, we're looking at 2 different prongs of this, aren't we? You're talking about some of the not-for-profits in town being able to sort of apply on a grant basis to utilize some of this, but we can also, as the city, utilize some of these funds too. So we're looking at 2 different tracks of an idea. We're sort of talking about it being able to be utilized in a grant funding sort of way, and we're also talking about being able to utilize it from the municipal standpoint to achieve some of those goals that are on the 6 categories, correct?
That is correct, and I'll start with your latter and then probably defer to council for the first one. But you're absolutely right, because in those 7 categories, the statute clearly articulates municipal juvenile review board. So here in Norwalk, we actually run the juvenile review board. Similar in Norwalk again, where other communities may have outsourced, for a better lack of word, their youth services bureau. Here in the city of Norwalk, we run the local designated youth services board. So essentially the city through those two entities can apply and will be eligible to receive funding to help support those two specific areas. And to your first question, and again, I'll defer. I know what I haven't read anything specific to the reporting, but I know in the ordinance, my department will be responsible of reporting how the funding used, but I'm not familiar with any reporting directly to the state, and I'll defer to council.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know if you tracked anything down along those lines. I don't remember seeing anything along those lines, but I can go back and look along with you.
I don't remember seeing anything along those lines. I believe when I was looking through it the last time, the way I viewed it is it's like the same thing as the Connecticut continuing legal education requirements. They tell you to do it. You have to certify that you're doing it. And if at some point they decide to audit you, you better have proof of it. So yeah. I think that other municipalities that have decided to do this aren't doing what we're doing. So I would think that when we do this, since we're putting it into a non-lapsing trust account, since it has to go through multiple committees for money to be spent, to be approved and everything like that, that there's going to be multiple layers of checks and balances. And we're also it appears to have the chief financial officer, at least in charge of receipt of the funds. So I'd imagine that we're going to have the appropriate accounting as well. I think that would be mandatory.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, David. I mean, we have structured this in a way so that there is a concerted paper trail. We're also going to be, Lamont's office will be responsible for publishing an annual report in terms of trust expenditures, as well as monies received. And as Brian said, there's going to be a clear log because the state's going to tell us what each of these places owe the city a municipal sales tax. We're going to acquire, we're going to get those funds, and then there's going to be a paper trail. That's the whole design.
The whole point is to be very transparent. I mean, we're holding ourselves to a really high standard in the city of Norwalk with this transparency.
We're holding ourselves to that standard in those terms. But my question, I guess, goes to the next step: the money that we're handing out. If we're handing out money to an outside organization that's not a municipal organization that we're handing out, are we also requiring them to do certain reporting procedures to us on the expenditure of that money? So that, because my question becomes is,
I got your point.
I'm going to defer to Lamont on that.
Yeah, Lamont,
that's what I want to make sure.
Yeah, so
right.
So we do have specific guidelines and just on our regular municipal grant funding contracts. So I am proposing that we adhere to what already exists. So we're not, and again, this really goes to capacity around, so we're not managing 5 different grant contracts and they all have different requirements. But again, I'll say, because this is watching, to the point around the simplified grant application, I really want to be sensitive to, again, to address equity, what we're looking at, the actual application itself. So that's not this cumbersome 20 pages that we're accustomed doing, but making sure that it meets our regulatory and our transparency and our accountability.
Great. Thank you, Lamont.
All right. It's 9:45. Some people might not have had dinner yet. I don't see any other hands up. I do want to thank all of our guests tonight, Steve, Deanna, and Lamont, especially Lamont, who had to stay so late. Thank you so much for all of your hard work getting us to here. And again, thanks to Josh and the Toms for helping out with this ordinance writing. And thank you everybody for making it a real
Brian.
Oh, and Brian, of course, Brian. We never thank Brian enough. Oh my God, I'm like looking around and he's in the corner. There's Brian. Yeah, Brian had to, back cleanup as he always does for all of us. So thank you all so much for coming and staying with us all night and making it a really very in-depth conversation. We really appreciate everybody's contributions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
I will take a motion. Wait.
Can Diana do it even though she,
Diana's still here. She knows what, I don't know.
I was just gonna ask if I can even do it, because I'm like,
can't do
You
it.
may not be allowed to
I'm
because
right
you're
here
on the
doing it.
committee.
Adjourn, motion to adjourn, stop
Tonight.
talking.
I'm
Bye.
right here doing it.
Dominique has a motion. Good night, everybody.